We're just setting up the YouTube live and then we'll go for it. Another few seconds. Eleanor's just popped on, by the way, Rose. Brilliant. So thank you very much, everybody, for dialing into day 3, session 4 of our Responsible Raw Materials Conference. And we're really, really excited to see everybody back and joining in with us today, because we've had some fantastic talks already this week, some fantastic dialogue and sharing of ideas. And today will be no exception. I know that I say every day has been truly brilliant, and well, today will be just as brilliant. We've got some brilliant, brilliant speakers lined up for you. As all of our lovely attendees begin to sign in, and those of you on YouTube, I can see you already watching up there. I'm just going to run through all the usual housekeeping bits and pieces, a brief summary of yesterday, and then what to expect from today. Just to note, we won't be doing this at the beginning of every session, because actually we've had some extra talks come in that we're going to slot in on these before and after slots with regards to the agenda. So don't feel that you can dial in late, because you will be missing stuff, even though, of course, everything is being saved online on YouTube, etc. as a whole. So my name is Dr. Sarah Gordon. I'm one of the co-organisers for this conference that we only started putting together, what, 2.5 weeks ago. And I'm joined by the lovely Rose, who many of you will have met when you were signing up for the conference. We'd also like to say a massive thank you to everybody else who's helped pulling this together. So the likes of Kieran and Ludovine and Ruth and Teresa and Christopher and Aldo and Sophie. And I'm now going to get into trouble because I will forget to give a shout out to somebody. Nobody give me an award, because I will forget some key people in terms of those thanks. But a massive thank you to everybody who's helping us pull this off. Also as well, thank you very much to those organisations who have donated money towards this. So the London Metal Exchange, the Mineral Deposit Studies Group, and of course SRK, who donated a lovely fat sum of money into the donation pot yesterday. So that's absolutely brilliant. Now, with regards to all of the normal functionality with regards to Zoom, so those of you who have dialed in as attendees, you've of course got access to the likes of chat, and you will find the little icon for that just down at the bottom of your screen. So if you click on the little chat button, you'll be able to send messages to all of our panelists, i.e. our speakers. And so feel free to engage them in debate. Obviously not whilst they're speaking, because multitasking is of course difficult, but they will be here for the majority of the session this morning, so you can ask them questions, share ideas, go for it. Also, down the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a little raise hands button. And if you click on that, you'll see that a little blue hand appears beside your name. And so feel free to click on that hand, especially if you want to get either Rose's attention or my attention, and we'll be able to come and help you with any problems that you may be having at the moment. Please note that you are intentionally muted, so you won't be able to speak. And we also can't see you if you're an attendee. So your video cameras, should you have them, are not enabled at the moment. So don't worry if that functionality isn't working. That is indeed intentional. The other button that you should have just down the bottom of your screen is a little Q&A button, or questions and answers button. So if you click on that, you will see that a separate pop-up box appears that you can move around over your screen. Sometimes it can be quite annoying because it happens to pop up just where you actually want to watch what is going on. So feel free to move that over to one side. And what you can do in there is you can ask questions, and we can then pose answers to you. So the panelists will be able to pose answers. Now, just to test this, I don't know if somebody out there wants to actually ask us a question, because then what we will do is we'll show you how to uptick, or there's a little thumbs up sign which you can click on if you really like a question that somebody is asking. You can feel free to click on the little thumbs up, and that means that it goes up the list in terms of the importance of it, and so therefore it's more likely that we'll be able to ask that question to one of our speakers. So With regards to all of that, that is the main functionality that you will have as an attendee into the session. If you have any friends or colleagues who would like to join us and haven't yet managed to sign up, etc., don't worry. We can deal with that. So all you need to do is go to the website and I will show you where in a second and sign up, and Rose will be able to send through the joining instructions so you can get into the Zoom environment. If you have friends or colleagues who don't want to sign up or can't use Zoom for whatever reason, I know that some companies don't allow you to watch to use Zoom, then as mentioned, we are streaming live on YouTube, and also everything is being recorded for future posterity. However, speakers, don't worry. If you make a mistake and you don't want this to be recorded forever and ever on the internet, just let us know, and because we are editing everything, so we will be able to work with you on that. Just to go back to the Q&A, so Victor has been absolutely amazing and taken my telepathic hint, and he has posed a very exciting question which just says test ? So those of you who are attendees and also panelists, you will be able to see this pop up in your Q&A box now. You can see I've just clicked the uptick. So I've just said, I think that this is a really good question. You can see that it's now got a little number 2, now a little number 3 beside that thumbs up. And you'll see that some of us might be able to send some answers, for example, to you as a whole. So you can see, Victor, I've just written you a little message back. So that's how the Q&A works. Just coming back to signing up and all of the other resources that are available to you. So if I just quickly share my screen so that you can see the web page as a whole. So hopefully you should be able to see our homepage with regards to our Responsible Raw Materials website. Anybody else who you would like to sign up, obviously this is just the sign up form here. We will also be using all of the email addresses that we're collecting, and don't worry, we're keeping them very safe, and we are by no means selling your data to anybody. We will use this to distribute any further materials to you from the conference, and this will be kept to an absolute minimum to make sure that you've got access to the resources in the future. As you scroll down here, you'll see that there is a donate option, and this will take you through to a Virgin Money Giving website. And you can see here that we've had some very, very generous donations come in over the last few days. So thank you very much to all of you who have donated money. As you can see, this goes to some fabulous charities, all of whom either focus on responsible raw materials or on, of course, COVID-19 as a whole. Now, we do have space for one more charity, don't we, Rose? So if anybody has a suggestion with regards to a charity that you think would really benefit from the funds that we are raising through this conference, please let us know. We'll be able to engage with them and try and bring them onto this platform so that we can send the money to them, obviously in a transparent and a robust format. So please keep those donations coming. Feels like I'm on sort of one of those fundraisers on TV. Anyway, I shall carry on. Also on the website, you will see here that you can go and take a look at the schedule, okay? And you'll see that we're now on Wednesday morning. If you want to download this, you can download it direct from the website. But perhaps most useful, we have the abstracts page. And what you will see here is you'll see all of the different abstracts from all of our lovely speakers. If you click on Wednesday morning, so this just helps you to sort those abstracts and therefore find what it is we're looking for. So for example, our first talk this morning is from Eleanor, who's dialing in from Australia. So if you click on that, you'll be able to see her abstract together with her biography there on the website. What we will be doing when we finish the talks, and actually we're in the process of uploading all of these for Monday's session, so we are running a few days behind, but we will be embedding everybody's talk into their abstract. So it is a single go-to place to go and find all of the information, all the fantastic information that the speakers have shared with us during the course of the week. So you will see, for example, in a couple of days' time that into Eleanor's abstract, we will be embedding her video of her talk as a whole. Also, down the bottom of all of the abstracts, you'll see our email address. So if anybody's having any problems, please just email us at hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And you'll see down here as well, so we do have Twitter, we've got LinkedIn, etc. So please feel free to keep sharing all of that lovely information. Final things just with regards to this. So obviously the live conference button just shows you how you can take part in the conference, which I suspect you're all experts at, seeing as you're already here. But over here, we have a learning materials page. And this is something that we are building throughout the week. And what we're doing is we're trying to collate together lots of material that people are citing during those talks, or material that will support everything that we're talking about as a part of this conference. So what you can see here are things like free online resources from, say, the Geological Society or from the Raw Materials Observatory, so their World Barometer, for example. So there are lots of brilliant online resources that we're just going to direct you to. But we're also putting together things like university style questions. So we know that there are some A-level teachers out there. We know there are some university lecturers, for example. And here will be some ideas based on some of the talks that we're listening to, some university style questions. So they might be essay questions, etc., that you can feel free to take away and use as part of your courses. The final thing that we're beginning to add on here, as we've had some brilliant blogs that are being written as we go through the course of the day, each day during the conference, and we'll also be posting those blogs up online, just providing you with a summary of each of those sessions. So if you miss something, don't worry, there's plenty of ways in which you can catch up. Rose, is there anything else I need to go through from a housekeeping perspective, or are we all good?
No, I think that's everything.
Brilliant. Excellent. Okie dokes. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a very quick summary with regards to what is it that we've heard over the last couple of days, and what can you look to expect from this morning's session. Obviously, we have 2 sessions here today, UK time. I realise that in Australia, we're now towards the end of the day, and our first lovely speaker is sitting in Australia, which is very exciting. But just to give you a quick recap on what we heard yesterday afternoon in our second session, we started off with a fantastic talk from Dan Smith, who was talking about how do we make best use of some of the byproducts that we might have from those materials that we are digging out of the ground, specifically the likes of tellurium. And he really brought home to roost some of the key intricacies with regards to the value of those materials. So what is the market price for some of these elements that we're talking about versus the ease or the difficulty with regards to actually extracting them as a whole. And the interesting thing with regards to tellurium is that the method through which the main product has been processed and is extracted from the rock has changed over the years, which actually therefore makes the harvesting, as it were, of tellurium more difficult. So you get this interesting balancing going on between the main products and the byproducts as a whole. And he obviously signposted some of the talks that we've got later on in the week, specifically with regards to the likes of cobalt, for example. We then had a brilliant conversation, a brilliant presentation from Jane, who gave us a fantastic overview of compliance, which is, of course, all of those different aspects that we need to be adhering to from a large-scale mining perspective, many of which, though, of course, are also applicable to smaller mining operations as a whole. And this really helps to bring together that jigsaw puzzle of the likes of compliance and governance, etc. And so Ludovine, who you'll see is on our panel with us this morning, she is the go-to person with regards to governance. So it was really nice that Jane could share all of her thoughts and insights to compliance as a whole. We were then joined by Tom, and Tom was fantastic. Tom shared with us some insights with regards to additional frameworks for looking at our resources and our reserves. So that is how much rock is in the ground, because of course what we're talking about during the course of the week is how do you take beautiful rocks like this, and I can see Catherine getting very excited because this is a nice pretty rock. This rock is full of the likes of copper and cobalt, much of which goes into one of these. So this is a mobile phone, the brand of which of course I'm trying to hide from the screen at the moment. And so what Tom shared with us was some of the ways in which some of those codes or that governance or our mechanisms for working out and reporting or communicating how much useful mineral or metal is actually in the ground that is actually accessible to us. So that was a fantastic talk there from Tom. He was then followed up by Victor, who not only shared his insights with regards to Tolstoy. So yes, there was a very well, there was a fantastic theme that was coming through on Victor's talk, but this was a case here of really looking at conflict minerals and what can we do with regards to thinking about that broader picture, moving sideways into the world of artisanal and small scale mining, which led really nicely into Sarah Caven's talk, where she really spoke about, okay, what's going on in the world of artisanal small scale mining compared to large scale mining, and saying, well, actually, we are all miners. There's no us and them. And what kind of business models might we look at in the future going forwards with regards to how can we all work together, especially where we're all trying to make best use of the same resource, the same rock that is there in the ground. That then led into the wonderful Frederick, who leads his organization True Footprint. And what he was talking about was how can you actually measure the true impacts of various different initiatives. So it's not enough just to donate money so that people can, I don't know, buy personal protective equipment with regards to COVID-19. You actually need to make sure, is that money really being put to good use? And is that equipment actually being used for its intended purpose? And more than that, is it really making a difference in that area? So he shared with us his thoughts around that, which was brilliant. And that then teed up our final talk of the day from Kat. And we've had lots and lots of comments with regards to Kat's talk following yesterday. And what Kat does is that environmental DNA sequencing. So taking that water sample from that water catchment area and then being able to harvest all of the DNA in it. So therefore you can get that understanding of what is the biodiversity in an area. And this just totally revolutionizes the way in which we can look at biodiversity within any environment, not just those environments where perhaps we are changing things because we are trying to go and responsibly source, extract, process, buy and sell all of those raw materials. So that was a really, really good collection of talks yesterday. At the last moment, we were, of course, joined by the wonderful Craig from Vancouver Island to share his thoughts on projects and responsible projects. And those of you who will remember, we had slight problems with his internet, but it's all fine because he will be able to contribute his thoughts at a later date. So thank you very, very much to everybody from yesterday. Now, with regards to today, we have a fantastic lineup for you, as per usual, and you can see some of their smiling faces in front of you now. But our lineup this morning, we're going to start off with Eleanor. And Eleanor, I think you're in Brisbane, is that correct?
Yes, that is. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, which is excellent. So Eleanor, we're going to come across to you in approximately 2 minutes. And Eleanor is going to give us insight into a whole world of her research, which is around the complex ore bodies database and really looking at the environmental, social and governance risks at the source of those supply chains. So Eleanor's research is groundbreaking. It is at the forefront of everything that we're talking about. So she's going to really tee us up well for the beginning of this session. So thank you very much for joining us, Eleanor. She's then going to be followed by the wonderful Catherine Goodenough. So Catherine, you can see her sitting there in front of her proud bookshelf of whiskies. I think that's a fantastic use of a bookshelf, Catherine. Thank you for that. As someone who grew up in Speyside in the northeast of Scotland, I'm loving your array that you have behind you there. And Catherine's going to talk to us about those rare earth elements, and how do we ensure that they actually have a responsible future. And of course, the thing about rare earth elements is that they're not exactly rare, but they are really, really difficult to work with. So Catherine will be giving us an insight into that. And Catherine is based in the UK. We're then going to move down to South Africa, to Zach and to Aidan. So Catherine, given the fact that no one's been able to buy any alcohol in South Africa, the two of them may not like your bookshelf. We're going to be joined by Zach and Aidan, who are going to look at how can you use good practice in times of plenty to prepare us for times of crisis. So they're going to be looking at how can you learn those good practices and then entrench them into the culture of businesses, etc., and into decisions as a whole. We're then going to come back to the UK, and Neil is going to share with us some insight into the modelling of environmental considerations to properly support decision making. Now, Neil is fantastic because Neil is not a geologist. He doesn't have a background in mining or raw materials. He doesn't have a background in sustainability, and he's not an investor in this world either. But what Neil is he has a background in being an actuary. And so he's a really clever mathsy person who can actually take all this data and make sense of it through those models. So apologies if I have done you a misservice, Neil, but I take my hat off to you with regards to what you can actually do and make sense of in this complex world. So thank you very much for joining us. We're then going to be joined by Julian Smallshaw, who's going to bring to us insight from the world of quarrying and aggregates. So we're going to move out of those base metals and things like rare earth elements into the world of quarrying and take a look at how can we make sure that we continue to have a competent workforce, and what does that workforce need to look like in the future. He's going to be followed up by Louise, who's going to talk to us about the Central Asia metals sustainability reporting. So now we're actually looking at how do we really land all of this in some of that communication through our sustainability reports. Kieran, who you can see on your screen, who's going to talk to us from the south of the UK, is then going to follow up on that and really bring home how do we look at some of our environmental and social maturity as a tool for actually guiding that path that we want to go through. And he's going to be followed up by the fantastic Michael Barron and Tim Law, who will be speaking to us about beneficial ownership. And so how do we make sure that all of that fantastic revenue that will come from the harvesting of these raw materials actually goes to the people who really need it and really deserve it within those communities and in those countries as a whole. So as you can see, a fantastic array of different speakers for you this morning, really to build on that brilliant discussion that we've had so far. But without further ado, Eleanor, if you want to find your unmute button and begin to start sharing your slides now. We're going to transport ourselves all the way around the world. So I'm currently sitting here in London. So we're going to go all the way towards the end of Wednesday, shall we say, in terms of time zone. We're going to go to Brisbane. And Eleanor, whenever you are ready, off you go.
All right, so can you all see my screen well?
We can indeed, thank you.
Great, I succeeded. Okay, okay, it's a bit strange to present at a conference while sitting at my home office, but try to make it work. So, first I'll talk a bit about the context of the work that I'm going to present. I work at the Sustainable Minerals Institute, which is really an institute at the University of Queensland that is really focused on mining, all sorts of aspects of mining. So we have two social centers, social aspects and health and safety. We have environment center, we have a water center, and we have production centers, which include geology, metallurgy, and also economic aspects. So it's really like a whole range of areas of expertise at the institute. And one of the key initiatives these recent years to try and increase the multidisciplinary collaboration within the institute was to create the cross-cutting programs. And I was one of the first postdocs to be enrolled as one of the main cross-cutting programs, which is the Complex Ore Bodies program. So I'll talk a bit about what complex ore bodies are, obviously, but you can see from the list of people that I have collaborated with for the past couple of years that it's really people from all of the centers. So Rick Valenta is the program director. He's also director of one of the production centers. There is, of course, Diana Kemp and John Owen from my center, which is the Center for Social Responsibility in Mining. Diana Kemp being the director of that center. There is Glenn Corder, who was the acting director of the Environment Center. Claire Coate, who's now the director of the Water Center, and other colleagues that have helped me along the way. So, so that's the background. So what is a complex ore body? So it has, of course, to do with the geological aspects and the mineralogy. Can be difficulties with low grades or with economics, but that was not really the point of my own project. My own project was to look at the locations of these ore bodies and look at a whole range of other aspects. And it's really the idea of situated risk based on the location of the ore bodies. So investors call it ESG risks. We like the term source risks as well, as source of the supply chain, and the idea of really situated risks. So just in case you guys don't know much about it, but I'm sure that you do, just picked up a few quotes from the news. What are ESG risks? So Zambian pollution lawsuit, so pollution lawsuit in Zambia. Production disrupted by a general strike in Chile, a 2-month road blockade in Las Bambas in Peru. And there is also lots of news about how the investor community is paying attention to these events. So the London Metal Exchange, with a planning a ban on cobalt said to be tainted by human rights abuse. There was environmental damage caused at Grasberg mine in Indonesia, and Rio Tinto had to pull out of this mine due to pressure from Norway. And of course, you probably heard about the Church of England letters to mining companies to ask for disclosures of data on their tailings dam after the catastrophic tailings dams failures in Brazil. So that's just a few examples to give you some context. At the beginning of this project, we also had a quick look at the top 40 undeveloped copper ore bodies, so ore bodies that are the largest in the world in terms of copper reserves. And we looked at evidence of delays, so acknowledged by stakeholders around the company. And we found that 17 of them had significant delays, so delays that were clearly unplanned and several years. And we looked at the contribution of ESG factors to these delays. So of course, it's based on disclosure, what is disclosed, and you probably know it's probably very hard to know what's actually happening at the site, but this is based on a desktop study. And in 11 of the 40 cases, it sounded like ESG risks were the main reason for the delay. Second aspect that we looked at is the presence of ESG complexity. So we mean the tendency of ESG factors to co-occur at the same place. So having environmental issues coupled with social aspects or even political problems. And there was a tendency of ESG risks to co-occur. So again, this is not representative of all ore bodies in the world, but it gives us some ideas that yes, there is ESG risks are able to contribute to significant delays and sometimes even compromise mining project. And also there is the idea of complexity of when there is that entanglement between different ESG factors, it adds to the complexity and it can even probably contribute even more to delays. So now I want to talk about one of the papers that we published few months ago now. And it's a methodology paper. So I'm going to talk a bit more about methodology, but I have a couple of slides at the end where I showed some results as well. I also put the title of the paper at the end of this presentation. So you're welcome to contact me if you want to have access to the full text. I'm happy to share it. So this methodology paper, we wanted to see how our idea of source risks was located compared to well-established methodologies. And we had the idea, the methodology, well-known methodology of critical materials and critical metals. And that aspect was a methodology that was quite close to what we were thinking, but not quite. So criticality is often two sets of factors. Is the idea of supply risk, so the risk of having a supply disruption at a large scale, and also the vulnerability to supply disruption, which is how much you need that particular metal, for example, for consumer purposes. The problem with these methodologies is the data is often national level. So we missed that granularity that we wanted to have. We wanted to really have an idea of the ore body level. The second type of methodology was the whole idea of availability and accessibility. And there is a lot of literature out there that are talking about, for example, the geological aspect, the issue of potential resource depletion, the technical issues linked to having low grades ore bodies. And often in this literature, they mention ESG risks. They say that they contribute, but I haven't seen any methodology really developed on quantifying them at global scale. So our methodology is actually located in between. It has the granularity of the discussions on availability and accessibility that are very mining focused, but it has also a bit of the criticality aspect because it's quite close to supply risk, but it's really at the source of the supply. So this is where it was located. So the methodology itself uses a lot of data. We have access to the S&P Global Market Intelligence database, which has tens of thousands of mining projects with their location, the commodities that are mined, the size, the grades, average grades, the reserves and resources. And on the other side, we have a whole lot of ESG indicators that we can find online. There are some water risk indicators. There is for example, the Human Development Index, all of these available data sets and indexes that we can find online. And what we did is we selected some of them that were relevant, and we did this spatial overlay, which really looks like this. It's various different maps that we overlay. And on the one side, we have points of mining projects, and on the other side, we have a whole lot of different indicators that we look at. So I won't go into the details of this. There has been a lot of discussion on which dimensions we should be considering, what is the most relevant to mining, and even more discussions on what are the different indicators that can fit in each of the categories. I very much wanted to have a perfect set with the perfect data, but of course there is always, when you look at global level data, you have issues of resolution, incomplete data sets. You want to find reliable data, of course, and you want to represent something that is meaningful for the purpose of your study. So considering all this, we couldn't, I don't think there is one perfect set of indicators, but we have a whole lot of indicators that we can shape and twist depending on the topic of the study that we want to look at. So this is in no way a final set, but we always work around these categories that you can see here. And so, yeah, I promised some results. So this is still from the same paper. So we applied this methodology first to the three major metals, iron, copper, and bauxite. And we were still always looking at this idea of co-occurring risk. So you see there is y-axis is the number of co-occurrent risks. So in the previous slide, there was 7 risks. So the co-occurrence can be between 0 and 7 risks happening, co-occurring at the same place. And we can compare commodities based on this using the S&P data. And so with this first study, we could compare these 3 commodities, and they have, you can see that they have different shapes. That iron has a more convex type of curve, bauxite is clearly more concave, and copper is a bit in between. So with this methodology, with the set of projects that we had, we can say, okay, the propensity of complex ore bodies is more important for bauxite than it is for iron, and copper is in between. So that was a first look at what the data can do and what kind of results we can get. And we can say that this can contribute to supply risk, and maybe in that case, bauxite is maybe a metal of concern. And there are many other ways to look at this data, and we've had quite a few studies since that time. And also there is, well, that's another way to look at it as a map with points with different, and try to localize the geography of ESG complexity. So that's another way to look at it. So I will just conclude here. I think this methodology gives us really some tools to look at aspects that we were not able to quantify before, and to really look at the source level constraints when it comes to supply risks. It's still an evolving methodology, and we are not done working with it, but yeah, I'm be happy to take some questions now. And here's so the second paper is the one I presented today. We have a previous paper also that we published last year. And again, yes, if you want to have access to these papers, the first one is open access, so you will be able to access it by yourself, but the second one is not. So just feel free to send me an email and I can send you a copy. That's it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Eleanor. And you can see us / imagine that fantastic round of applause going on behind those muted microphones. That was absolutely brilliant. And there's some really good chatter going on both in chat and through some of the other channels as well. Just with regards to those graphs that you showed with regards to the iron, the copper, and then the bauxite, i.e., I guess, aluminium, with regards to what most people will know the output from bauxite being, was that data, was that coming from existing mines, or did it include projects that are on the table as well?
That's a good question. I forgot to mention that. So for this study, we only looked at undeveloped mining projects. So we stopped. So the S&P database has the different stages of development for each mining project. So we looked at ones that were in past very early stage of exploration. So let's say from advanced exploration to pre-production. So it was kind of forward-looking, thinking, okay, this is probably the set of mining projects that we can have in the future. We didn't look at operating mines for this paper.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. And so from those graphs as well, I mean, would a very high level summary be that we think that going forward, it's going to be more difficult to guarantee those bauxite projects compared to those iron projects, or am I misinterpreting those graphs?
Yes, so we can think that there is a higher ESG complexity for the whole set of bauxite projects. So if this theory works out, then it means that, yeah, there can be more problems with taking these ore bodies into production.
And are there any specific reasons that you want to leave us with regards to why bauxite might be so difficult?
If I remember correctly, so it's in the paper as well, we decompose each of the risk categories. If I remember correctly, there was a lot of complexity around land uses. So for some reason around bauxite ore bodies, we had a lot of cropland, pasture lands, forests, And so it sounded like, and also population density.
Okay, brilliant. Those pesky people living on top or nearby to where all of those beautiful ore bodies are. Does that sound like a geologist speaking? Brilliant. So thank you so much, Eleanor. That was absolutely brilliant and a fantastic way to kick off today's first session. So again, another round of applause for the lovely Eleanor, and thank you for dialing in so late from Brisbane.
Thanks for inviting me.
We're now going to come back to the UK, and the wonderful Catherine Goodenough will be finding her unmute button and her share buttons so she can share her slides. Catherine is a geologist, so I can see her chuckling away with regards to those comments concerning bauxite and copper and iron, etc. And Catherine's going to give us a really great insight into some of those key elements on the periodic table that are really, really difficult to deal with. So those are the rare earth elements. Catherine, if you want to hit presentation mode, I can see that happening, and over to your lovely self.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'm going to concentrate just for the next 10 minutes or so on the rare earth elements, which is something that we've been working on for a good few years through the EU Rare, SOS Rare and High-Tech Alp CARB projects. That's better. The rare earth elements, what are they? Why do they matter? Most of us have probably heard quite a lot about them. And if we look at the European Commission's criticality assessment, this is the 2017 one, and I really don't expect you to read all of the names of the metals there. But as Eleanor was just saying, most criticality assessments plot economic importance against supply risk. And for the rare earth elements, what we see, and what we've seen in every criticality assessment done in the last 10 years, is that they plot right at the top. They're seen as economically important and having a high supply risk. And the rare earth elements, they're a group of 15 elements, and then they're used for a whole range of uses: catalysts, polishing, but the most important uses are in the permanent magnets that are used in many types of wind turbines and in electric cars, in driving the motors. And of those 15 rare earth elements, the most important ones are neodymium, praseodymium, and dysprosium, often talked about as the critical rare earths, because they're used in these applications that are expected to grow, cause growing demand over the coming years. So why are we interested in the rare earth elements? Well, many of you will know that it goes back to around 2010. And this diagram illustrates the issue really well. This diagram is from Roskill and Asian Metal, thanks to our collaborator, David Merriman. And it shows the range in rare earth element prices over the last 20 years or so. And it shows the spike in 2010, which was down to the fact that the Chinese export quotas were tightened significantly in 2010. And that really pushed up that price spike. Since then, rare earth prices have recovered, as it was recognized that really the export quotas weren't so much of an issue. But you can see that they've bumped along at a slightly higher level with peaks and troughs up till 2020. And that price spike has driven really a lot of exploration for the rare earth elements. It's driven a lot of research. It's driven a lot of interest in these elements as critical metals that we really need, and that we're expecting to see demand growing. Now, why has that interest happened? Well, really, it's because if you go back to 2010, you can see that almost all the production of the rare earth elements came from China. And that's why the Chinese export quotas were such an issue. And in terms of environmental and social governance, I guess there were concerns about China at that time. There were quite a lot of news stories about environmental impact, about illegal mining, that kind of thing. And there were also concerns about security of supply. And simply, if China decided to tighten its grip on rare earth elements, could the world get the rare earth elements it needed? Well, since 2010, things have changed significantly. And if you look at the latest USGS figures, which are the figures for 2019, what you now see is that in terms of production, so in terms of actual mining of the raw materials, China is only producing around 2/3 of the world's rare earth elements, with significant production in the USA, Myanmar and Australia, and a whole host of other countries producing smaller amounts. So superficially, that seems great. The security of supply issue to some extent has been solved. Let's just take a look at those different sources for the rare earth elements and have a think about, whether it's made a significant difference in terms of responsible raw materials. So I'm a geologist, as Sarah said, and so I'm going to bring in some geology and just mention the different types of primary rare earth resources. So you can group them into high temperature deposits formed by magmatic and hydrothermal processes, basically in the roots of ancient volcanoes, and then low temperature deposits formed by processes that occur at the Earth's surface, like erosion and weathering. And a lot of the exploration over the last 10 years has been in alkaline igneous rocks and carbonatites, which are known to be the highest grade sources of the rare earth elements and which occur in every continent and indeed in most countries across the world. And also a small amount of other types of deposits like vein and skarn deposits. And then we have the mineral sands, the laterites and the iron adsorption clays. Iron adsorption clays, particularly in South China, represent the source of much of the world's heavy rare earth elements. And also the possibility of producing rare earths as byproducts from aluminium production from bauxites, which we just heard about from Eleanor, and also byproducts of phosphate production from phosphorites. And Francis Wall, who led two of our major recent projects, including SOS Rare, published a paper on responsible sourcing of the rare earth elements in Elements, the journal, in 2017, which I highly recommend looking at. And it included this nice table, which shows that the high temperature deposits, the hard rock deposits, like your alkaline rocks and carbonatites, are, they may be quite high grade, you don't have big footprints for the mines, but there's a lot of issues around the energy that has to be used to mine and crush and grind those rocks, then to process them, the complex minerals, the amount of chemicals you have to use. Environmentally, there's potentially an awful lot of issues around energy use and chemical use. By contrast, if you look at some of the lower temperature deposits, which are often looser material at the Earth's surface, you might need to move a lot of material. You might need to have a large footprint for your mine, but you may not need an awful lot of energy to do the mining and to do the crushing and grinding. And some of your processing might be quite simple. The amount of chemicals needed might be quite variable. And so that gives you the greens that you can see for iron adsorption clays and mineral sands. One of the problems that you will notice for mineral sands is that they are often associated with high radioactivity because the rare earths are in monazite, which typically also hosts a lot of thorium. And then the bottom two rows show that if you can produce rare earths as byproducts, that has a lot of advantages because often the rare earths would otherwise be in the mining waste and you can produce from those. So how have the different rare earth sources that we use changed over the last 10 years or so? Back in 2010, the main sources were, of course, in China, the large Bayan Obo carbonatite mine, and also iron adsorption clays, as I mentioned. Very small amounts were produced in Asia, in various countries, India, Thailand, and others, from mineral sands and also alkaline rocks in Russia. As we saw, the price spike drove a lot of exploration, and it drove the opening or reopening of two major mines, Mount Weld in Australia and Mountain Pass in the USA. Mount Weld has continued operating ever since. Mountain Pass has been up and down, stopping mining in 2015, restarting in 2018. In China, mining has expanded. They're mining rare earths from several different deposits. And through the last 10 years, but particularly we saw this around 2015, they have tightened up their environmental regulations and their governance for rare earth deposit mining. So that actually now, when you look at mining in China, some of the issues that concern people in 2010 have been largely dealt with, and they're making real efforts to reduce illegal rare earth element mining. However, what we see in the USGS figures is that from 2018, we start seeing production of iron adsorption clays for rare earths in Myanmar. And in terms of environmental and social governance, that is potentially a real issue. And those raw materials are taken into China for processing. And in 2020, as per that diagram I just showed, We've got rare earth mining in many countries, in iron absorption clay and mineral sand deposits, and in most cases, those ores are taken to China for processing. And here's a map that is nothing like as advanced as what Eleanor showed, but just showing the countries where we have rare earth production. This is the 2018 map. And if I just pop on some arrows that show where rare earth raw materials from those deposits go for processing, you can see the answer is almost all China. In other words, what we see is that we're producing rare earth elements in mines across the world. But most of the time, the raw materials are going to China for the processing. And so China really does control that value chain. And so China is very much in control of everything that's happening in the value chain. But much of its production and its processing is now actually really quite well regulated. They've made a lot of changes in China in their rare earth industry over the last 10 years. And maybe we shouldn't have so much concern anymore about environmental and social governance of the rare earth industry in China. But perhaps what we should be considering, and we hadn't thought of this, I don't think, in 2010, is that production may have expanded to a range of different countries. But now we've got many smaller producers mining rare earths in iron adsorption clay deposits and mineral sands across the world. How is that governed? There's relatively little information out there. And what happens to the thorium if the rare earths are being mined in monazite? Again, there's relatively little information out there. And rare earths are being produced as a byproduct, for example, of titanium in mineral sands. But in terms of the big phosphate and aluminium production, although that seems like a really good potential for producing rare earths, there's been a lot of research, but the technological and economic issues are such that at the moment there's no significant production of rare earths through that route. And finally, of course, recycling still remains limited. So the overall kind of sum up of this is that since 2010, rare earth production across the world has broadened significantly. China no longer controls mining. So we've achieved the diversification of supply that perhaps we were looking for in 2010. But has that been a benefit or not? It's an interesting question. And as we've seen today, press releases from the World Bank on mineral production soaring as demand for clean energy increases, and from The Guardian talking about green energy firms delivering multi-billion-pound wind farms, then we can see that these questions are going to continue to be really important. And I'm just going to plug, if you'd like to learn more, you can go to our Hi-Tech Outcarves massive online open course in FutureLearn on technology metals for a green future. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Catherine. And yes, you can hear that wonderful applause ringing in your ears at the moment. And if we may, Rose and I will also provide the link to that resource that you just cited now on the website as well. So if that's okay with you. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah. Also as well, by the way, if anybody's not aware, the British Geological Survey also has a huge array of other really good online resources as well. So whilst we're just letting those questions come through, Catherine, so what you really clearly showed in your short presentation just now was that diversification of the actual digging or the scraping of the rare earth elements out of the ground, but all of it seems to still go to China. So if we moved that, so back in 2010, when 97% of the world's rare earth elements came from China, what percentage of the world's rare earth elements are processed in China today? Do you know?
I can't answer that exactly, but I know that Mount Weld in Australia, the mining there, all of the rare earths are processed in Malaysia at the LAMP facility. So that's a bit of vertical integration going on there. Otherwise, there's small amounts of processing. For example, Brazil and Russia, I think, are doing domestic processing. But most other rare earths go to China for processing. And so I'm going to say, including those from the USA, and so I'm going to say that it's between 85 and 90% of all the world's rare earth elements are processed in China. So China absolutely still controls that value chain.
And why is that, Catherine? I mean, so what is it with regards to this processing that nobody else can do?
I think technologically, there's obviously quite complex beneficiation and processing because you've got 15 rare earth elements in every mineral. And most of the time, what you want is your neodymium. So to go through extracting the rare earth elements as a group from those minerals and then getting them separated so you can get the neodymium out, it's some fairly complex chemistry. And there's been loads of research across Europe and across, I'm sure, across the USA, of course. But in terms of scaling those processes up to industrial scale at an efficient and effective way, China has real control.
So is that something, I mean, with regards to things like the European Critical Materials Initiative and industrialization strategy and lots of R&D money, so that research and development money going into, how do you pull apart all of those elements that all fit in that funny box that sits down the bottom of the periodic table, which is there because they're all so similar? Do we see any future with regards to trying to pull some of that processing out of China to get that diversification, or do we think this is just how it is at the moment?
This is a really interesting question, and I see that people like Vitor Correa are online who have been really involved in some of this. So I was working on the EU Rare project, and there was a terrific amount of research and up to pilot scale on beneficiation and processing actually for European rare earth deposits in that project. And of course, we did have rare earth processing in both in France and in Estonia in the past. And those processing plants are now more dealing with recycling and not really, as far as I understand it anyway, unless there's anyone online who knows more, not really with primary rare earths. So we have had that technology, but for many companies, it's much more efficient, effective, and economic to do that kind of processing in China. And so, in fact, much of that has moved. So we have a lot of expertise in Europe, but to actually get the next step to progress it to actually happening again in Europe requires not just technical expertise, but a lot of economic interventions as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Catherine. And there's another question, apologies, that's just come through from Mikhail. And what he's asking is around, so I guess if we phrase this with regards to all of the thorium, for example, that perhaps is something that we're concerned about whenever we're mining something like mineral sands, for example, so the iron absorption. So if you're talking about a large company, obviously there's lots of compliance, there's lots of rules and regulations generally that those companies are beholden to, either on an international scale or perhaps on a company compliance scale, as it were. How can we make sure that those smaller mines, for example, are adhering to those requirements? And I think, as you were alluding to, aren't actually causing more of an environmental problem, especially with regards to things that may be radioactive, for example?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and which I can honestly say that I don't know the answer to. I feel this is something there's not a lot of easily available information in the public sphere, and it's not something that I've looked into in huge amounts of detail. But what we do know is that if you are mining a mineral sand for, let's say, ilmenite to produce titanium, you're going to have most of the time monazite associated with that mineral sand. And so you're going to end up storing your monazite somewhere, but as a naturally occurring radioactive material. So what's happening now is that in many cases that monazite is being separated, sent to China for processing to extract the rare earths. Fantastic. And then you probably have thorium as a byproduct, which has to be stockpiled. And then it's probably no longer in a naturally occurring mineral, it's being separated. And of course, if there's a use for that thorium, fantastic, obviously. But what I don't know is what happens at that stage in the supply chain and what's happening to that thorium. I genuinely don't know. I'd be really interested if anyone does. I'd be interested to hear.
I think just building on this, and I know, Catherine, you said, yep, we'll be interested to hear, but maybe as well what Mikhail is getting at is, so yesterday we had a fantastic talk from Sarah Caven where she was talking about the artisanal small scale through into the large scale mining. And something perhaps that's really interesting about mineral sands is actually a lot of the comminution, so the crushing of the rock has already been done. So therefore, if you are a artisanal or small scale miner, the sorting of that rock's really easy, relatively speaking. Do you know of any artisanal or small scale mining operations where people are separating out the mineral sands and so therefore potentially leaving themselves with piles of radioactive minerals, or is it something that's more being done by the large scale mining companies? Because in order to make any money from it, you have to be able to send your product to China.
It's a really interesting question. And I would say in terms of mineral sands, from what I know, we're talking medium to large scale companies. You know, there's dredging, that kind of thing. It will be mechanized. It may not be huge. Whether there's any sorting going on site or not, I don't know. The only mineral sands producers that I've visited personally haven't actually been separating out the monazite. It's just gone into the waste piles. The iron adsorption clays, well, that's something that does happen on a real artisanal scale. And often that is a case of using large scale chemicals, often in situ. So you pour your chemicals in at the top of the hill, let them leach out the rare earths on their way down and collect them in ponds at the bottom of the hill. And in China, that's being increasingly regulated. But in Myanmar, I don't know, who can say, I would think.
So maybe, I guess, then there is a suspicion that some of these environmental problems, whilst China's been doing a fantastic job on actually getting to grips with some of those environmental problems, maybe some of it's being pushed sideways slightly.
Yes, I think that does seem to be to some extent the case. But like I say, in terms of public information out there, I think one of the issues is that some of these concerns are being moved to countries that perhaps don't have such strong governance of their mining and mineral sector. I've been to Myanmar and talked to people about this, so I am really aware that this is an area where there's significant concern. Brilliant.
Well, thank you very, very much for that fantastic talk, Catherine, and hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Round of applause. Thank you very much. Great. Fantastic. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go from the lovely Catherine down to South Africa. So we're going to go to Zach and to Aidan. So gentlemen, if you would like to find your unmute buttons, and if you've got slides that you would like to share, now is your opportunity to do that. I can see Zach is sharing his slides at a precise second in time. So Zach and Aidan, over to your wonderful selves. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Difficult to follow such a great technical presentation, particularly with one that's not particularly technical. We have been thinking a lot and working a lot with clients and discussing a lot kind of the shift from if you like, pre-COVID, but into some systemic change that may drive. And you know, when COVID first started, sorry, give me a second. When COVID first started, there was this joke that went around a lot with who led the digital transformation of your company, and was it the CEO, the CTO, or was it COVID? And I mean, I'm sure many people have seen this, but it's a true thing. You know, this virus achieved in the space of a month and a half what change management hadn't been able to achieve in 10 years, you know, and drove this massive digital transformation. And well, we've been talking about and thinking about, well, who's leading the sustainability transformation and the risk transformation and the strategic transformation in these companies? And of course, these are all interrelated. I mean, all very similar. And a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last 5-10 years is around the change management, around trying to drive some of this change, but conscious that this massive event is taking place and driving a lot of that. I'm going to ask Aidan just to talk a little bit about these risk and societal fault lines, because he's really got a much closer grasp on them. But it's something that you know, exists, and as I say, we've been talking about for a number of years, really trying to see, well, what are the gaps? Let me leave that to Aidan. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And you know, when we look at the current situation, and if we just use the SDGs as a bit of a lens to kind of diagnose what is happening around us, we've just taken a view of the platinum group metals industry. So countries that are involved in the mining and fabrication of PGMs, Belgium, Germany, Russia, South Africa, and the UK, and using the SDG index as a view of what were the foundations like. So 5 years into the SDG agenda, which is a 15-year agenda, how are countries doing? And you can see from the color coding that there are significant challenges across all countries when it came to looking at SDG performance. So that's some of the bedrock, if you like, of what has been happening and how the fault lines have been emerging in response to COVID. But if we look at South Africa specifically, because this is our country, we know it a little bit more. What it has shown is that certain SDGs are a lot more in focus now than they were previously. And SDG 3 for all countries is obviously the primary concern. That's where the virus and pandemic is really, putting a big challenge on public health systems and in individual health. But what we're seeing in South Africa is that fault lines on 2 other SDGs are way more prominent than they were before, specifically SDG 2 around hunger and SDG 6 water. And that's because of the poverty levels in our country and the economic impacts of lockdown, people are going hungry. So where we were making good progress on SDG 1 in terms of moving people out of poverty, what we're seeing is that people are now taking a step back. We're having to, organizations in the country are having to focus on food parcel delivery and the provisioning of water and infrastructure required to serve rural communities, especially communities around mining companies, is a problem. And that's because of the underlying effect, if you like, of SDG 1 poverty and the inequalities in our country, which then just raises the profile of work that should have been done a bit more strategically and with intent around SDG 11, around the sustainability of our communities, and then SDG 8, because a few weeks of lockdown has introduced a set of economic impacts that have put all of those SDGs severely at risk. And we have a view that when you look at what drives performance on those SDGs and whether those SDGs drive performance in other SDGs, we begin to see that we've got to look at those SDGs a little bit differently to be improving performance at them, because the current situation has just raised the profile of those SDGs, and the fault lines are there and are amplifying the challenges that we have to face. Back over to you, Zach.
Thanks. So, I mean, I think one of the key things is that this is the picture right now, but the truth is that these fault lines have been around for a long time, and I think there's been some great work in trying to understand how we can start to address them. You know, everybody's talking about these new economies, and if you haven't read The Donut Economy, this top left, it's one of the most fantastic models that's come out in the last number of years. A woman called Kate Raworth. I may be mispronouncing that, but the donut economy really says, look, for society to continue, we have to live within these bands. You know, there's a social foundation minimum that we need to be producing to keep everybody alive and healthy, and then there's an ecological ceiling in terms of how do we not be greedy and not create this incredible environmental and socioeconomic destruction that we've been creating. The point is, there's the circular economy. You know, we talk about innovation, we talk about the sharing economy, the experience. The point is that there are a number of models that have been coming out over the last 15, 20, 30 years, talking about how do we shift into a space that is less kind of our standard economic model of supply and demand, and just create, okay, create, throw away, create, throw away, create, throw away. And so at a very high level, this has existed, and I think that this moment in time is likely to move us more strongly towards some of those. The challenge from our perspective, and certainly this has been the case with clients, is how do you now translate that to a corporate level? And one of the things that we've been asking is, what if when we report, what if when we do our strategy, what if in everything that we do at a corporate level, we answer these 3 questions? We talk from an economic perspective, how are we contributing to the fiscus? And there I'm talking broadly. So I'm including in that your your shareholder returns. I'm including in that things like your tax. I'm including in that your money that's going into savings. But how do you generate an economically strong company? what are we doing to this generation? So from a societal perspective, what is your business doing that is impacting the current society? And there's a lot of work there. And I know in South Africa, again, you know, there's this group, Business for South Africa, that has grown out of nothing at the start of this crisis and has the most incredible approach on saying, we are not, nobody in it is trying to make money. It's about 300 to 400 very, very senior business people from around South Africa, all volunteering time to try and address the health, but also the economic crisis that's occurring. And then finally, the last question around the environment is, what are we leaving for future generations? And I think if we start to try and answer those three questions in all of our reporting and all of our approach, our strategizing, etc., we begin to think about things very differently, and we begin to think about the whole value, the complete value. Now, this isn't our model. This is actually based, the questions asked, but this is based on the Stockholm Institute model, which they've developed off the SDGs, talking about three layers: biosphere, society, economy, and they tag all of that together with partnership, and really about how the SDGs fit into these. So from our perspective, and we've been talking about this for a long time, this concept of whole value, of a company presenting their entire value set, value proposition. And when we talk about value, we're saying, well, what value do you add to the world? Not what earnings do you achieve every quarter. You know, now if you're a chief exec in the last number of years, you've had this massive challenge because you've got this liquid capital challenge in that capital is shifting very quickly, trying to find the short-term highest returns. There's this fear of failure. There's a real herd mentality around how that capital moves around. There's less and less investment for long-term, investment for stability. But at the same time, you've got society with these kind of louder voices, challenging you to be good. And these are, you know, these often raise what we call charismatic issues, you know. So you might be a company that's doing a lot of real good in the world, and you might be adding value and you're employing a number of people, but you produce a lot of CO2, for example. Now, we can argue as much as we like about whether that supersedes everything else. The fact of the matter is it's only part of the picture. And so unless you can show that whole picture, you will continue to just be caned about the CO2 emissions. So we really try to migrate to this picture of looking at it at whole value. And what we've seen more and more as we've worked with our clients is this begins to de-risk the company. And I think we're seeing, and we're doing a little bit of research on this, so I don't want to guess what the answer is going to be until we've seen it come out. But I think we're going to see that companies that have a better picture of their total value to society have survived or have worked their way through this COVID crisis much better because they are more stable. So there's a de-risking. There's an intent and accountability to society, and this creates this two-way accountability that civil society can turn around and ask the big questions, ask the difficult questions, but equally an organization can turn around and say, well, guys, have you considered the full picture? And this is a space where the SDGs remain very relevant. I think there's been quite a lot of chat of, look, COVID set us back 3, 5, 10, 15, 20, you know, who knows, you know, but a number of years. And does this mean that we're not going to hit the goals? Very possibly we're not going to, but the framework remains so relevant as a basis, as a mediating framework for this whole narrative about our intent and about our complete performance. So when you start to take the SDGs and you weave them in, you look at your organizational risk, you look at your strategic focus areas, and you look at your SDGs, and you start to get a woven picture of how all of these interact, you begin to understand that this is a much more, that having visibility across this very complex environment becomes so much more important. And by doing this, we can start to identify, well, what are the key things that we're really trying to monitor and trying to stretch ourselves in order to ensure that we're not just targeting earnings or just targeting short-term thinking and charismatic issues. And so coming out of this, what we've seen with some clients that are starting to use this is, when you start to increase this visibility, we have our strategic flow, our strategic planning, but then start to turn this into specific tactical visibility approaches. And you begin to create a much more stable system. You begin to create a system where you can build strategic resilience through having more intentional approaches to your interactions and your ripples of impact. You can understand, Aidan spoke very briefly, but this image on the right here is this mapping of which SDGs drive which other SDGs. So all of them are very, very interrelated. And when we start to understand that interaction and that interrelation of these, you see, well, if we do X, Y, Z, A, B, C are going to happen. And what does that look like? Then we can also start to identify these fault lines and where they expose us and our organization to additional risk, and we can start to manage that proactively. And finally, we get an opportunity, and this is, I think as South Africans, we often feel like we're the only ones who really need to push our governments hard to do better, but we're clearly not. I think that's come out very clearly during this crisis, is that actually governments all over the world are just a little finding it a bit tough. And so there's definitely an opportunity here to engage and support public institutions to reimagine and start to repair some of those societal fault lines a bit more proactively. And that's where we see this taking a complete view, taking a full framed picture, understanding where all the interrelationships are, begins to create a de-risked environment. Because although one more huge world-defining events that happen, and I did see a little while ago, it was a better picture from a corporate company perspective of what that whole mesh is and where we sit within it. Okay. Any questions?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Zach and Aidan. That was absolutely brilliant. And a round of applause coming at you from around the world behind all of those muted microphones. Just as we let those questions filter in, so we've obviously got a number of different channels where the chat is going on, which is great. I think with regards to this, guys, I mean, it's fantastic to see the evolution of what you're doing. It's really exciting. You've obviously got that business case in terms of how a company can be more resilient with regards to a crisis such as COVID-19 if they're looking at the whole value with regards to what they're doing. Have you seen any examples where, say, investors or customers or communities, for example, are using this approach or making use of it to try and rank or benchmark companies against one another?
Yeah, a bit more of a difficult question. I think, some of the investors that we've been speaking to have been saying, look, they are still battling to interpret, they conceptually approve of it, but they're battling to interpret how that translates into actual share price. I think one of the things that we're seeing here is that by companies that are taking these sort of proactive approaches and being able to de-risk, if we have a look at, I mean, I'm reticent to mention a specific mining company, but one of the leaders in the space has been Anglo American, and they have gone through this crisis in the same way everybody else has, with their hair on fire, but they've been able to shift and move around and respond much more quickly and much more fully than many others. Some of the other mining companies that we've been working with in South Africa have had a similar approach. One of the big chemical companies that we've been working with. So I think, from an investment perspective, I think it's more that there may be a slightly lagging indicator there of investors beginning to see that these organizations that are behaving in this full way are less risky and are more stable through that process. And so I think that we may see a slight lagging indicator on that. I mean, Sarah, that some of the work that we've done with, for example, the Church Commissioners and the Transition Pathway Initiative, there are investors that are driving very strongly and very actively this kind of next step in responsibility. But for the broader investment market, I think that there will be a shift towards better understanding of the risk that they're exposed to. And when they can present this as a full picture, when companies present this as a full picture, investors will start to say, okay, well, those are less risky companies. I'm going to invest more. And there I'm talking the big investors. I mean, I'm talking the pension funds and the guys for who risk is a real big threats are a bigger challenge than the opportunity of the uncertainty.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Zach. And I think what you're describing there is, of course, not necessarily the holy grail, but it's what all of those investors are after at the moment. How do they get that true risk profile rather than just the financial, for example, risk profile or technical risk profile of a company? Brilliant. One very, very quick final question for you, Zach and Aidan, if I may. And this comes from Christopher Reeves. He says, always good to hear Zach and Aidan. Given the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were written for governments to achieve, how have you looked at the weighting of the SDGs for business so that they show how they are enabling / contributing rather than being responsible for, and therefore becoming surrogate development agencies? So that's the business versus government question.
So it's such a great question, and it's what our whole business was born out of. Was we began with developing a translation layer, effectively, if you like, from that government level down to a company level. And I think to answer that question very specifically, I don't think that it's the responsibility of companies to achieve the SDGs. And I don't think that's what we're trying to say. I think what we're saying is that using the SDGs as a framework, because they are such a good framework, and it could be another one, we could replace it with something else, but the concept of using them as a framework to show the whole value and the interrelatedness of all of our activities is where the real value is for companies. So the intention here is not to say each company must hit those goals. The intention is to say, if a company is spending and working in this area and this space, what are their progressions and how are they doing? And that's really where this kind of tactical visibility that we've spoken about, starts to come in, is being able to say, okay, well, within your own space, within your own key headline metrics, what are you achieving and how are you progressing?
And Zach, if I could add to that, practically, I think what this means for companies is that the best practice that has emerged over the last 5 years is for companies to choose kind of 4 prioritized SDGs to focus on. And they've done that through a range of methodologies, but fundamentally it's been about, what does that look like as a prioritization to certain stakeholder groups? And I think now, looking at how these fault lines have emerged and how brittle and fragile our efforts have been in relation to some of these SDGs, we're going to be able to see how a prioritization of SDGs, not trying to achieve all 17 of them, but as a business focusing on a distinct set, is going to have ripple effects and knock-ons that we would like to see that kind of seam over these fault lines a little bit more. And I think along with the revision of targets of SDGs, I think we're going to have companies looking at their prioritization a little bit differently, and not necessarily pandering that prioritization to stakeholders who are shouting the loudest. And I think, Sarah, back to your question earlier as well, I think communities are going to be looking at their needs a little bit differently as well, because where they thought they were okay in relation to some of the SDGs, they've now realized that, no economic activity for a few weeks raises other blips on the radar, and they're going to be looking at their own needs and how that partnership between private and public institutions moves society forward. Brilliant.
Thank you very, very much. Aidan, Zach, another round of virtual applause. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, guys. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to fly north from the wonderful South Africa up to the UK, and we're going to go to the wonderful Neil Cantle, who is going to share with us some of that insight into the modelling of how can we actually put some of these numbers, etc., behind all of these complex issues that we've been talking about here. So with that, Neil, over to your lovely self.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. I guess my mission here in this talk is to try and show how, when confronted with something multi-layered and complex like environmental considerations, it is actually possible to model those. And I think it links well with the last talk, actually, showing how you can get a really nice holistic view of what's going on. So I suppose, yes, I'm an actuary. I've been outed by Sarah in the introduction. And we often look at things, I guess, by looking backwards. We tend to try and look at what happened through the similar sort of circumstances in the past and then fit some kind of statistical model to that. But I think inherently that's a problem. That just looks at what happened. It doesn't really address how, whereas most people in the real world are much more interested in how things happen. So there's a real disconnect in a way that a lot of modelling actually takes place. So I suppose with something like an environmental situation, you have to really get your head around a complex system. Things that happened in the past, lots of interacting factors, lots of different things which have led you to today. And getting a clear picture of what's happening now does rely on you actually understanding the journey that you've taken. It sort of gives you a clue about the momentum that you have going into the future. And obviously a lot of the modelling that you want to do is about bounding your understanding of that future. So if there's an infinite number of things that could happen in the future, that's not very helpful if you're trying to make decisions and think about how your business progresses or the societal decisions that you want to take. So an awful lot of what this modelling approach is about is trying to bound that future problem and try and make sense of the dynamics that might play forwards. So this is the recipe. I'm a consultant, so obviously icons are the key tool here. The first step is to understand what the problem is. And we actually use a lot of techniques rooted in the social sciences to get that part done. So talking to a range of experts, diverse views, different worldviews, lots of different opinions, lots of challenge, and actually try and construct that narrative in all its complexity to try and capture what people currently understand about what's been going on, and importantly, what they think might happen in the future. And then you boil that down to a minimally complex view of that problem. So we're trying to get to the real core. If it was a movie, we want the plot. The rest of it's exciting and interesting, but we're trying to get to that real core understanding of the key drivers which are playing out. And then we can challenge ourselves by looking at data. And I think up until quite recently, what we found is that people have just focused on structured data, which is a bit like the joke of looking for your car keys under the light, because that's where you can see, but you drop them somewhere else in the dark. And what we're beginning to see now is that you can use, in a commercially viable way, things like artificial intelligence to listen in to the conversations people are having about certain topics. And I guess in the work we've done, it's probably fair to say that a lot of environmental issues absolutely need to include perceptions. The way people respond in advance of physical threats is one of the key things that drives decisions and drives real outcomes, like asset values, for example. When you're modeling these things, to ignore them would be a real travesty, frankly. So what we're doing is processing that data, looking at it in all its nonlinear glory, trying to work out whether we can sniff out inconsistencies, whether we can look at tipping points coming on the horizon, which might challenge our perception of how likely something is. Often what we find in statistical models is people massively underestimate how likely an extreme outcome is because they've ignored the context of the current situation. So given all of that, we had a theory, we've looked at some data and challenged ourselves, and now we can update our theory about the future, and that's a really key part. It's a theory about the future. It's not looking backwards at statistical information of what has happened. Now, our weapon of choice here is causal models. Bayesian nets are one of my personal favorites. And actually doing that enables us to combine all of the expert judgment with all of the data. So we're being very, very explicit about what we do and don't know. And the model therefore contains the uncertainties that we might have about that future. And it tells us the consequence of that uncertainty. So if there's something that we really, really do need to know better, the model will show us where that is and what the consequences might be. And ultimately, it's all around getting insights about how that future plays out. So this is just a little picture of what a Bayesian net looks like in real life. And the reason we choose this tool quite often in our work is because they go backwards and forwards. So we can ask questions about what if the situation in the future would look like this? What are the consequences and the outcomes of that? And again, linking to the prior talk, it captures financial, non-financial, the full range of different outcomes that we're interested in, and shows us the tensions between all of those different outcomes. But importantly, it enables us to ask the reverse question and say, if I'm looking at a particular outcome, where did it come from? What are the sets of circumstances underlying the drivers that drove us to that particular outcome? And I think for me, in the monitoring of progression towards certain outcomes, that's really helpful. A lot of people actually misunderstand how factors combine, and they focus on lists of indicators rather than looking at them all in context. And so being able to come backwards and forming those reverse stress kind of questions is really important. So pulling all of that together, modeling complex and adaptive situations absolutely is possible. We've certainly been doing it for 15 years quite successfully. So I think it's important that people feel confident that that can be done. And really the focus moves from just doing statistics to actually understanding and learning, becomes a dynamic process rather than just modeling for its own sake. And a crucial insight there is that it's about the interactions and the dynamics. When you're modeling complex things, the outcomes emerge. So trying to model them directly would be insanely complicated and not very fulfilling. But if you can actually model the rules themselves, then you can just explore what the outcomes might be from those. We also want to get a mixture of expert views and observations. So we form theories and then challenge them with data, but ultimately the expert's the person who's got to form the view about what's going to happen in the future. And that's what should go into the model, not just the data. And we want to be super explicit about the uncertainty so that the model tells us what the consequences are of what we don't know. Importantly, I think for environmental issues, we want to bring in those perceptions. How do people feel about something that could happen in the future? And how will that impact their actions now? The model has to absolutely take account of that. So, final comment, wicked problems like environmental considerations absolutely can be modelled. Thank you very much. Questions?
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Neil. And again, there's lots of chatter going on in the background with regards to this. A lot of that chatter is around, can you maybe give us a bit more of an insight into how do you model feelings?
So I guess there's two parts to that. The first step is to understand why the feelings matter. So putting them into the context of, if somebody feels strongly about a particular aspect of an environmental issue, then what does that lead them to do? So you want to form the narrative that puts that in place. And then the second thing, I guess, links back to this use of AI, which is quite recent in terms of its sort of wide applicability, is you can actually listen to what people are saying and then process that in terms of what is the conversation, how strongly do they feel about it? Who are they talking to about it? Is it sort of maniacs in an asylum talking to each other, or is it a widespread conversation which is being logically dissected? So the AI processing part now actually enables us to structure a lot of our understanding of that problem, and then that forms inputs into the model.
So just with regards to the AI, when you're saying we can listen into what someone's saying, we're not talking about eavesdropping. Is it more trying to understand what they're truly saying? Is that right?
Yeah, for legal reasons, I'd say no. But a lot of stuff that we've done, actually, you can look at social media and then contrast that with science journals, government conversations, mainstream media, blogs, anything digital that you're legally allowed to listen to, and even things like the dark web. There's ways of consuming that which won't get your lawyers upset. And you can actually listen in to what people are saying in all of those different forums, and then really the conclusion is about contrasting and comparing them. So dispersal of conversation through each community, consistency between different communities. Those are the things that really start giving you a way of forming your own view as the expert as to what that tells you.
So when you're beginning to put together a model, as it were, what are the basic building blocks that you need, Neil, for you and your team to begin together to put this together to then be able to get some answers or some better understanding out the far end?
So I think that crucial first step is the narrative. So we need a group of people who believe they understand the problem to try and talk about it and tell that story. And that's crucial. Without that, you're just looking at what you can find rather than what you need. So the first step is to construct the narrative, get diverse views, challenging views, see if the story makes sense. Is there inconsistency in that story? Are there gaps? And once you've got that first part done, everything else sort of flows. So if you've got data for some of that story, but not other bits, then fine. You know, the data informs the bits that it can. The expert judgment informs the other bits. So it's that first step which crucially makes this work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Neil. So given what we've been hearing, say, for example, this morning and over the course of the last few days, where you're getting lots of different perspectives from different people who believe that they perhaps understand a bit of the problem, or at least are trying to describe the magnitude of an aspect of the problem, is this the kind of information that helps you get going, or what more do you need?
So I think it's creating this almost sort of Bayesian learning loop. So you form a theory, look, update the theory, and then look again. And so actually, interestingly, we did do some modeling on pandemics about 8 years ago for someone, and the model that they have exactly shows what's currently happening. So people's response in advance of the actual infection and so on are much more important than the infection itself. So obviously it's a devastating medical emergency, but all of those sort of social factors massively swamp every kind of business decision that's being made.
So are you finding it difficult not to say, I told you so?
I may have just done that online, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much. There's another question actually that's just come in here from Ludovine, and she asks, does this analysis show up the inconsistency of statements versus actions or outcomes? And the kind of impetus behind this question is that would be incredibly precious to convince investors to invest in more engagement with companies on environment, social governance, rather than just trust superficial, perhaps, reporting.
Absolutely. And I think in a way, a lot of the work we've done on transition risk in this space emphasizes that. So people say we're going to be net zero or net negative even, and they say that in public, but then all their actions speak the opposite. And so actually bringing in those sort of tangible tensions between the statements and the actions in the modeling does show that if somebody says they're doing something, it should lead to an observable outcome. And if the model shows you what that is, it's very obvious then if it doesn't do it. So I think for me, that's why modeling the how rather than just the outcome is super important to hold a lot of organizations to account, and to be fair, to give credit to the ones who are doing the right thing.
And is this something, Neil, I mean, are there any case studies of where people have been using this and it's working, not necessarily within mining, but in other sectors that we can maybe look at and learn from?
I mean, certainly it's something that's become a real priority in the financial services sector, because the Bank of England has asked everyone to look at the really granular analysis of their balance sheet for 2021. And obviously it's been delayed a little bit due to obvious circumstances, but they're being asked to assess their balance sheet, all of their investments, all of their liabilities through the lens of climate change. And they're finding that really challenging. So the transition risk in particular is something they're struggling with. How do you assess how people will react X years in advance of a physical event in the future? And they don't know how to answer that question. So certainly that's where a lot of our recent focus has been, in helping them think through how property prices might suddenly change, or airline stocks, dare one say, it might suddenly change because all of a sudden flying's not fashionable. So that perception-driven transition risk is where a lot of this work currently is being deployed.
So in terms of your normal clients, as it were, Neil, are they normally in that sort of financial insurance type space, or what do they usually do?
So I think for us as a firm, obviously we're sort of primarily in the actuarial space. So insurance, financial services, so banking, asset management, they're our sort of go-to place. But actually we've deployed this across the whole sector. I think dairy was my favorite one. That was different. Who knew about cows? But certainly I think the application of the technique is very broad, but it depends which sectors get the nudge. And financial services currently have had the nudge. I think the extraction industries had it earlier. And it's just sort of following that nudge around the different industries to make sure that they're thinking it through properly.
Brilliant. Thanks, Neil. One final question that's just come in from Julia. And she asks, are there any problems with bias in terms of the original expert views and where that may lead to the modelling, i.e. in terms of gender or other differentiators?
Absolutely. So what we do to try and combat that is we use a technique called cognitive mapping, and it sort of strips away a massive amount of that bias. So we're able to compare and contrast different people's views. We can assess whether or not we've got diversity of view across sort of culture, gender, whatever perspective you can bring. And I think that first step is so important to actually reveal that bias and challenge people with it. If you actually follow through a lot of data-driven things like predictive analytics, they're massively biased, but because you didn't do the first step of talking to real people, of course, you don't know that. So an awful lot of medical studies sample people of one sort of cultural background or sort of ethnicity, and all of a sudden, oops, the treatment doesn't work for that other group. So yeah, absolutely. That first step crucially surfaces and largely mitigates that particular threat.
Brilliant. Well, with that, thank you very, very much, Neil. Round of applause from behind our microphones, and thank you for bringing all of that into conversation. That's fantastic. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to maybe come back down to earth from the heady heights of this modelling. And one of the reasons why we invited Neil to join us for the conference here today was actually to bring in very normal techniques. They're great techniques, but they're very accepted techniques that are being used in, say, financial services, insurance, etc., as Neil mentioned. And this is a case where these are techniques that we can be using more within the raw materials sector as a whole, and perhaps they're skill sets that we need going forwards. So this is a case here where I know that Julian is in the process of sharing his screen at the moment. And as we see the PowerPoint is now opening, Julian will be talking to us from a quarrying perspective, and also the importance of investing in a competent workforce. So we're not necessarily, I'm sorry, Neil, we're not necessarily talking about hiring lots of actuaries, etc. But I'm sure, for example, we can bring in your skill sets and very much use them going forwards. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I see that Julian's come off mute, which is brilliant. Julian, over to your lovely self. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. Thank you for that. Right down to earth now, and we're going to be looking at why I think it's important to invest in a competent workforce. So these are the main areas I'm sort of going to focus on. Why we need a competent workforce, how we build one, how we maintain it. So training is usually the first area to get cut by the accountant when times get tough, and this time is as good a time as any time to talk about. However, when times improve, it still becomes difficult to justify. So partly because it's difficult to quantify. So if I just talk about why you need a competent workforce in a little bit more detail. So if I start off with a brief overview of competence and build on the theme. So competence can be described as the combination of training, skills, experience, knowledge, and other qualities that a person has, and their ability to apply them to perform a task safely. Other factors such as attitude and physical ability can also affect someone's competence. I've just talked about performing a task safely, and in the UK, the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, spelled this out loud and clear in legislation. It's a key area focused on by the regulator on inspections and, of course, accident investigation. Safety is paramount, it's number one. However, competence is part of a deeper organizational context. This encompasses company culture, leadership, communications, and resources. So if we look in isolation at some of the building blocks that help a company create a competent workforce, you can see the individual elements are fundamental to a healthy, sustainable, and profitable business. This clearly is what will differentiate a growing, profitable company from its competition. What could be better to drive growth and secure profit than making sure you have a well-trained, competent workforce that's deployed efficiently, paid correctly, and fully compliant with internal regulations and external regulatory requirements? Not only is it the most efficient and safe method of working, it is unsurprisingly the most cost-effective and profitable. This is how having and managing a competent, motivated workforce gives you the power to outcompete your competitors in a variety of ways. Competence is the basis for business growth in a safe and sustainable way. So, you won't achieve any of this without a competent leader driving the necessary competencies. And in a recent survey published by the Harvard Business School, 195 global leaders were asked to rate 74 qualities. Not surprisingly, strong ethics and safety came out at number 1, but the other top perceived competencies were being self-organized or empowerment, being empowered, having clear communication expectations, efficient learning and nurturing growth, that's being committed to ongoing training. So we can say that global leaders believe in an ethically safe organization where personnel can be empowered to think and make decisions and be given resources to develop themselves. So, as the slide says, it sounds like a transformational leader would work well, and we've got that framework that's in front of you there. Now, I think the link between this type of leadership and success seems to work and fits well with what I've just spoken about. Not all leaders are or have to be transformational, but having some of these elements must surely be beneficial to a business. Transformational leadership models must consider empowerment as a critical aspect of organizational leadership styles, where increasing employee empowerment strongly motivates positive attitudes and behavioral outcomes, things like competency, performance, satisfaction, commitment, trust, and positive moral values. Thus, these positive outcomes may lead employees to sustain and support organizational competitiveness, not just in national business, but also in a global business as well. So again, just looking at those 4 quadrants, we've got leaders who are role models. We've got leaders who should motivate. They should encourage innovation and creativity and problem solving. And also leaders who act as coaches, which I'm going to talk about shortly. And another important point, we as an industry have a demographic of 57, and it's amazing to say, 57 years old. We're an aging industry, and we desperately need to attract young people into the industry. So there's another quote here for some recent research. So this is a quote from a study on attracting the younger generation. So our findings demonstrate the need for leaders to take a transformational approach when it comes to managing and motivating graduate and early career talent, the so-called millennial generation. And why? Well, to do so means building winning teams, breaking down barriers, celebrating and rewarding successes, and identifying and developing those with the greatest potential within organizations. So this is where I link in coaching and mentoring, because that was one of the very important elements within the framework I just discussed. So I'm going to concentrate now on a key area which helps drive the competences we've talked about, helps to drive these forward. And it actually links all of the 4 previous quadrants within that concept together. So you hopefully noticed a key competency requirement within the leadership framework we've just discussed was coaching leading to empowerment. Coaching is recognized as being important to most organizations, and it recognizes and encourages every individual's growth and potential. Coaching supplies the challenge and support for people that need to explore their undiscovered potential, discover their strengths, and learn from their mistakes. Now, we don't do enough in our industry, and I'm talking about the quarrying and mining industry. The Institute of Quarrying has recognized this and has ambitions to help the industry better understand the processes and the requirements. However, linked to coaching is mentoring. This is an area that the Institute is working on right now. It's an invaluable tool for supporting a coaching culture. A well-designed and well-implemented mentoring program leads to an increased number of powerful developmental conversations taking place in an organization, leading to increased employee engagement and talent retention, which is what we need. It can help people make significant role transitions. It can support people who are fast-tracked to more senior leadership roles, change organizational culture, embed new skills and behaviors, and improve retention within the business, and also support talent pools. We have a huge untapped resource within our industry, which we could help transfer knowledge to a younger workforce. This is something we're working on. We've done some pilot work on this already, but unfortunately things have come to a little bit of a halt with under circumstances at the moment. But the mentoring approach is something that the Institute is really working on heavily, and we think is an easy win. So, big question, resources. Okay, so competence is an all-embracing term. It starts with the right leadership. It starts with that organizational culture. And there's also, you need the resources to make all of these things that we've talked about happen. So a business needs the resources, which tend to involve time and money, of course. Firstly, the business needs to identify what competencies an individual has and those they need to develop. This is where coaching can help. Incorporate competency evaluation into performance appraisals, which will help an individual exhibit the values and beliefs of the organization. The competencies will form part of the role description. There are a range of competence-based, knowledge-based and knowledge-based qualifications which fit our industry, many of which link back to the National Occupational Standards. So if we look at a competency framework, it can be split into core competencies that reflect the values of the organization and other competencies that reflect role and responsibility. The competencies are made up of functional components, which could be technical, and behavioral, which are soft skills. A framework will vary from company to company and should be integrated into performance management procedures so you can measure performance, give feedback, identify the needs, and formulate a succession plan. The time taken to invest in developing your team can more than make up for the time you would spend dealing with motivation problems, resignations, or recruitment issues. Your organization will only be successful in the long term if it can realize the potential of everyone who works there. So that's the end of my presentation now, everybody. I've rushed through, I know, the thoughts and processes around competence, but I think they're all interlinked between the different facets that we've talked about over the last few minutes. So that's partly my thoughts and ideas on competency and how it can affect a business and support a business and make a business financially successful. So thank you.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Julian. So round of applause from all of us around the world. And this is a case where the questions are beginning to come in for you here. So for example, there is a comment that comes from Alexander, and he says, what a nice presentation. Give an extra comment about the need for rejuvenescence. So I think if you get what I mean, work teams as a whole. Would you be able to comment on that?
Rejuvenate, is that bringing in younger, fresher talent into an organisation?
Yeah, I think if we go with that, and then Alexander, if we're missing your point, please add to it. He says yes. Fantastic.
Yes. So we have, as I mentioned, we have a big issue in the mining and quarrying industry, not just in the UK, but really certainly in the developed world, where we've got this demographic into the upper 50s. So we need to be able to try and bring new talent into the industry. There are a number of initiatives. There are a number of initiatives that we're doing over here in the UK with the Institute of Quarrying and other extractives institutions as well, where we're actively going out to schools, and we're actually going out and we're going out there and telling people what we do in the industry, what a fantastic industry it is to be in, and all the positives. There's also, and we talked about the environment a little bit earlier on, there's some massive, huge, super environmental projects that have gone on and continue to go on within the industry. So it's getting the right story out to people and getting people to understand what the industry is about and how, without this industry, we'd have nothing at all. We wouldn't have any infrastructure, wouldn't have any roads, we wouldn't have any cut, we'd have nothing at all. So it's an understanding to the younger generation. We've also developed, which has been working well for the last couple of years, developed a higher apprenticeship over here in the UK, which is primarily aimed at bringing 18-year-olds into the industry. So there's been several hundred new people coming into the industry. So there are initiatives out there. I don't think we do enough, but it's certainly on the agenda, and we certainly are working on it. So I think we all have our own commitment to go out there and promote the industry as being a positive industry to have.
Great, thank you very much for that, Julian, and thank you, Alexander, for that question. Just with regards to what you were saying there, Julian, about actually trying to share the value of the likes of quarrying, etc., with society as a whole, because I think a lot of the conversation over the last couple of days has been around, do people actually understand where these raw materials come from?
Yeah.
Is that something that you see, almost the ability to communicate and the ability to educate and share that knowledge with everybody around about us? Is that one of the core competencies that you would see being necessary for somebody within this space?
Yeah, definitely. I think it is. The more people we can get the message out to, the better. We just need to get that message out there. I mean, I remember many years ago, and there's been a number of initiatives driven by businesses, by companies as well, where they've actively asked managers to go out to schools and talk to people and get that message across. But there is, I think there's an overriding need to do something, and we're certainly working on a number of initiatives, not just the Institute of Quarrying, but other organisations as well. The unfortunate thing is that things have obviously come to almost a grinding halt at the moment. But I know one of the organisations that within the industry called MPQC, the Mineral Products Qualifications Council, who we work closely with, have been training ambassadors from the industry to go out to educational establishments and actually talk to them. That process has started. Of course, it will take a long time to work through, but these initiatives are actually working, and hopefully will start to drive some younger people into what is an amazing industry, I think, and we don't make enough of it. I think it's also a place where the trade bodies as well can help.
Great, thank you. And just to that as well, Julian, I mean, obviously, the coaching and the mentoring and that, leading to empowerment, exactly as you were saying, is absolutely crucial. Do you see that the skill sets that are needed within the community are changing? So, for example, speaking as an exploration geologist, primarily with regards to base and precious metals, once upon a time, you just rocked up and dug a hole, and you didn't, the kind of, as a sector, people didn't really acknowledge things like environment and social aspects, for example. How do you see all of those skill sets really coming to the fore and everybody going forwards? Because of course we absolutely can't do it in the future the way that we used to do it in the past? And do you see any problems actually with some of the mentoring aspects?
Right, okay. Well, going back to the mentoring side of things, I mean, mentoring, some of us probably are doing it without knowing it. We don't do enough of it, and one of the issues that I've got a big bugbear with is that as I mentioned, we have a huge resource. We have an issue with the demographics, so we need to do something about it. We have a huge resource. We have this huge natural resource of talent, of people that have all this knowledge and understanding that needs to be shared with the great and the good. So for us, mentoring, I think, was an easy win. It's relatively easy to set up mentoring schemes. And what we wanted to do was bring some structure into the industry. So we'd actually started, and we would have run one the other week, but started a set of pilot days where we bring people in, and it's the first of a process, if you like, that will possibly build towards a qualification, where we bring people in and actually tell people what mentoring is and give some structure to perhaps something that they may have been doing or may not have been doing. And it's been very, very popular. So we've had a wide range of people that have come to us and said, look, we really want to help. I want to do this. So the mentoring side, I think, is all important. And I think it's an easy win for the industry, to be perfectly honest. And it's something that we were working on, but it's gone on hold at the moment.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much, Julian. Mentoring is indeed a skill and an art, and it's something that is actually quite difficult to get right. So that's brilliant, all of the support that you're giving to people. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together, or your virtual hands together, wherever you are, whilst Julian, if you can please stop sharing your screen, that'd be fantastic, as we change gears slightly and we come across to the wonderful Louise. And I think, Louise, you're joined by Nigel as well, is that correct? Excellent. There's lots of nodding that's going on there. That's fantastic. And Louise and Nigel are going to talk to us about Central Asian metals, and specifically with regards to your sustainability reporting. So this is actually hearing people who have to put together this reporting, etc., and use it. How do you actually go about doing it? So Louise and Nigel, if you guys have got slides to share, now is your moment. Fantastic. There we go. Thank you very much. And in your own time, take it away. Thank you very much. Oh, and Louise, I think you're on mute at the moment if you're trying to speak.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Sarah. I'm Louise Rathall. I am Director of Corporate Relations for Central Asian Metals, or CAML as we're affectionately known. And just 3 or so weeks ago, we published our first sustainability report. So I thought today I would talk to you about the process that we've been through in the last 12 months or so, since first deciding to write the first report to actually getting it published, as I say, just very recently. Hopefully you can see these slides. So the first slide is the standard disclaimer that we put in our presentations. First, I thought I'd give you a very brief introduction to our company in general. So we're a low-cost, diversified base metals producer. We've got 2 operations. We produce copper in Kazakhstan, and we also have an underground zinc and lead mine in North Macedonia. In terms of our size, we've got a market cap of around $300 million US, and we're listed on the AIM market of the London Stock Exchange. So moving on to the sustainability side of things. So before we talk about the process of how we wrote the report, actually, I think, for any company looking to go down this track, you've really got to make sure that you've actually got sustainability really embedded into your business before you can start to commit to writing a report. Because I think it would be pretty clear early on that it wouldn't have the depth required if you didn't really have this subject fully embedded in every aspect of your business. And we really do have, actually. We started producing from our first operation, Kounrad in Kazakhstan, in 2012. And in 2013, we hired our sustainability director, a chap called Nick Shirley. He's a site-based guy. He spends half his time now in Kazakhstan and in North Macedonia, really hands-on at the two sites. And he's been instrumental for us to make sure that we've got all the bases covered for sustainability, particularly in terms of health and safety, the environment, and what we do for the communities as well. So we've been reporting in our annual reports commentary on what we used to call corporate social responsibility, CSR, since 2013. And for many years, actually, that was sufficient for investors. I think they found it interesting and a sufficient snapshot into what we're doing, and giving them comfort that we had this important area covered. Around about 6 months ago, in November last year, we also strengthened our team furthermore by appointing Dr. Gillian Davidson to the board. She's an independent non-exec director for us. She's a very, very strong sustainability background, and she chairs our sustainability committee. So having, as I said, written commentary in our annual reports for many years, why did we decide to publish a standalone sustainability report when it isn't theoretically a requirement? And I think that the reason for that is that it became pretty apparent to us early last year, early 2019, that there was a sort of shift and a change in expectations, predominantly from the investor community. Investors nowadays, fund managers, they're under pressure to make responsible investments. There's initiatives like Principles for Responsible Investing, PRI, that many funds have signed up to. A lot of the big investment houses have got growing ESG departments, and they're ensuring performance in these areas as well. And this is actually coming from the people that invest into these funds, the likes of you and me, that increasingly want to support sustainable businesses. It's also really important, actually, to explain what you're doing in terms of sustainability to your other stakeholders as well. So governments of the countries in which you operate, NGOs, local communities close to your mines and your operations, and also your employees as well. It's really important for your social license to operate. So from the realization that we wanted and would pretty much soon have to be writing sustainability reports, how did we get started? So we did a lot of internal research, actually, and once you start looking into it, there's a lot of information out there. So first, we started by looking at what our peers were doing in this topic. Other mining companies of similar sorts of size to us, some listed on AIM, some listed on the main market of the stock exchange, and also what larger mining companies were doing as well. In the last few years, there's been an increase in the amount of independent sustainability research written as well by companies. And this research is bought by the investors. And so there's companies such as MSCI and Sustainalytics that write research on companies to explain the sustainability performance to funds. So MSCI has written some research on us, and that was very useful as well to get an insight into areas that they thought that we were strong in, and also obviously areas that they thought we could improve in as well. There's lots of other guidance from groups, external groups that are focused on sustainability, such as GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, SASB, there's the UN Sustainable Development Goals as well. So you can get lots of information and understanding as to what people are reporting, and therefore what your stakeholders want to read about. Onto the actual investors themselves. So a lot of the bigger funds, again, the BlackRocks, the Fidelities of this world, they actually publish their own ESG guidelines on their websites. And that sort of tells you what they expect from you in terms of the E and the S, and also in terms of the governance as well, the board composition, remuneration, those sorts of topics. So you can get quite good clarity from what some of your shareholders expect from you. And I think one of the things that we did do, which I would encourage other companies to do, is we actually went on what we called an ESG roadshow. So myself and our chairman went to see many of our larger shareholders, and we actually told them that we were planning on writing our first sustainability report. And we actually asked them what they wanted to see from us, areas that they thought we should publicise more, the sorts of disclosures that they were looking for. And some of the feedback we got from that was really quite important and helped to sort of frame our approach to this report going forward. So in order to actually get stuck into writing the report, the first step really for us, and I think for many companies really, is to undertake what's called a materiality assessment. Now for us, this was a desk-based study. We engaged in an external consultancy to do this for us. And what that means is, they analysed a huge amount of internal data that we sent to them, plus also external data, good industry practices, what our peers are doing, recommendations, etc. And from all this information, they put together a list of the most material sustainability aspects for Central Asia Metals specifically as a company. The other crucial part to doing this materiality assessment actually is a practicality. Once you've got this then starts to form a very good framework for your report. So what you can see on this slide is actually the 5 sustainability pillars, as we're calling them, that came out through this materiality assessment process. So what we do here within each of the pillars, there's sort of subsections, and on those sections is what we report. We report for each of those our approaches, we report our data as much as we can, because data, actual numerical data, is very, very important for stakeholders, for shareholders, so that they can start to compare you against your peers and compare you against your own previous performances as well. And we also gave case studies and, very, very open and honest disclosure about areas that we think we need to improve on, and areas that we think we've had also some successes in during the year as well. So I'll just go through these very quickly from left to right. We've got delivering value through stewardship. And sorry, I should also say that these will be different for every single mining company. However, simplistically, they're probably going to be broadly similar topics that stakeholders and shareholders as well are going to expect you to cover. Likewise for the topics underneath them, for how we break them down. Some of them are very obvious topics that you'll find that mining companies you'd expect to have information on these topics. So sorry, going back to delivering value through stewardship, this is really being a good corporate citizen, good company governance. And what you're going to explain in this section really is your structure and lines of responsibility for sustainability. Wants to be clear to the stakeholder that you've got good lines of responsibility, that sustainability is the responsibility of everyone, from those working at the mine up to the board and back again as well. Risk management processes will also come into here, as will your company policies. Things like code of conduct, human rights, modern slavery, and all those should be disclosed as well on your website. They should be available for people to see. Moving on to the health and safety side. From safety in particular, the stakeholders are looking for information on any fatalities or lost time injuries. They also want a frequency rate actually for those, then they can start to compare you against your peers as well. So it's that sort of data that they're looking for from the safety front. In terms of health, any occupational health issues that are being generated in your workforce by your operations, and also comments on well-being, what you're doing to improve the lives of your employees, any initiatives to try and encourage them to live healthy lives, etc. Moving on to focusing on your people, that's really your employees. So how many people you employ, how that breaks down into age groups, into local and expats, gender diversity, etc. And I think the areas there that are of particularly importance is the amount of training you do for them, how you bring out the best in the teams that you've got. Local hiring is really crucial as well. That's very important, to try to encourage training and skills in the local community rather than simply flying expats in from developed countries. And also gender diversity is a growing issue and area of concern and interest for stakeholders. I think mining is viewed as a sort of industry that used to be male dominated, and there's a real push to encourage more women into the industry as well. The environment, obviously a very important topic, and we reported here on air quality, water usage, rehabilitation and biodiversity. And I think also the two key areas here that really jump out at you in this topic that investors in particular are going to want comfort on is tailings. I mean, that's been a huge area of increased focus in the last 12 to 18 months. They want to be sure that your facilities are as safe and secure as they can be. And then the other major topic, not just for mining, but globally, is climate change. Investors want your greenhouse gas emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2, and also any initiatives you've got to try to reduce that going forwards as well. And last but not least on here, unlocking value for the communities. So what you do within the communities, the relationships you've got there, any difficulties, any challenges, social spending, and the types of projects that you support as well. Also within that will actually be local procurement, prioritising buying your supplies from the local areas, and paying your taxes, etc. It's good to show that you're generating value for the local and the national effort as well in the countries in which you operate. So I'm going to leave you on this slide, which is a few of our sustainability highlights from 2019. And we chose these as we thought these were areas which would be of most interest for our wider stakeholders. And I think really just to sort of leave you with some thoughts on this whole process. It seemed pretty daunting to us to start to write this report, but I think my advice would be to any smaller companies such as ourselves looking at doing this. I really would go for it. I think the feedback that we've had from our investors so far has been really, really positive. I know that there's areas that which we can improve on for next year, and we're already working on those. We've had some constructive feedback from these investors, but the overwhelming view has been they've been really pleased that we've laid out almost like a baseline study of where we are sustainability wise. And so we've given much greater disclosure and much more comfort really to the investors that we've got these bases covered, and that we've got good initiatives and plans in place to keep on improving in these areas as we go forward. So I think I've run on a little bit, but I'll leave it there, and I'll be happy to take any questions if anyone has any, and if we've got time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Louise. That was absolutely fantastic, and a really, really good insight into a company as brilliant as yours, who's actually bitten the bullet and said, right, let's go for the sustainability reporting, etc. Now, I know there are a number of questions coming in and chatter going on the different channels, but a question from me, which is, when you first started putting the report together, how much of this data did you already have versus how much did you have to go and find or start recording within the organization?
Yeah, it's a really good question actually, because a lot of the work had been done, almost behind the scenes by Nick Shirley and the team that he's got. So my first thought was, right, how much of this do we actually know? Do we need to start scurrying around measuring things? And I was really, really comforted to know that for all the areas that we initially identified, that we had been measuring these things for a long time. We did have the data. One thing we did do actually was, because the greenhouse gas emissions is such a key area, to make sure that we'd been measuring that properly over the years, we actually got an external consultant in last year just to check that we were measuring and monitoring and reporting those really correctly. So that was one small change that we made. But actually, broadly speaking, we have been monitoring these aspects, and there have been priority areas for us throughout the year. And that was really interesting from the materiality assessment. Definitely the right thing that we did, but I think comfortingly, it didn't really throw out anything that we didn't already know in terms of what our priority areas were, and they were the bases that we were largely covering.
Brilliant, thank you, Louise. And to that as well, I guess just building on that question, is there anything that, say, the investors look for, or the different sort of almost reporting frameworks look for in terms of numbers, that, to be completely frank, isn't actually all that useful to you as a company? So you're just having to collect the numbers to tick a box in a way, rather than using it to actually help drive decisions deeper within the organization?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say that all the aspects that we've reported on and the data and the data that we have been reporting has all been areas that we've felt are material to us. I think going forward, one thing we think we could look towards doing next year or the year after, actually some of this will be COVID-19 dependent, is whether to work towards actually reporting to a set standard, be it GRI or SASB. And that may bring in some more of the aspects that you're mentioning. I think there's more sort of boxes to tick per se, whereas this really was our work, our material topics, and really we just put forward what we felt was important. But I think there's probably growing areas from the investors, etc., that they'll want more disclosure on in the future. And I guess one of those is probably going to be Scope 3 emissions. And that's not a track down which we've yet gone, but I suspect it will be only a matter of time before that's a new area of focus. So I think that's probably one example of your question that you're asking.
Brilliant. Thanks, Louise. And one final question, which we will just sneak in here, and this comes in from Karen. And she's asking, can you tell us more about how you developed your priorities, i.e. to what extent was there consultation with your workforce or internal engagement, and this front loading on ensuring the understanding from the bottom up? How can that support engagement, ownership, performance at operational site levels, as opposed to being the top-down directive?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good point, actually. So we've done stakeholder engagement work and studies, particularly in North Macedonia, because we bought that mine 2.5 years ago. So we've done a lot of work there. We also feel we've got a strong understanding of that in Kazakhstan. We've got regular meetings with employees. We've got regular meetings with community members as well. And we feel like we have got a strong understanding of what they want. But Karen's question is very valid. And one thing we're looking towards doing potentially this year, again, COVID-19 dependent, is to almost take a step back and do a full stakeholder engagement questionnaire process. And I think that would really push home, the actual bottom-up approach to really double check that the areas that have been deemed material by all the work that's been done, in part, that's based on some of these stakeholder engagements that we've done in the past, but really to double check that those topics are the ones that are deemed material by the employees, the communities, the governments, shareholders, etc. So that's definitely a track that we want to go down, hopefully this year, but there'll be some practicalities in that given flying restrictions, etc.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Louise and Nigel, who had an easy ride of it. Nigel, unless there's any final comments you'd like to make before we go to our next presenter.
No, I think Louise has done an excellent job of presenting the company and what we've done and the focus we've had on this over the past few years. Well, or as Louise said, from 2013. So it is in the fabric of the company, but it's good that we make a start externally publicising what we do. And this is a growing trend that's not going to go away. We all know that, and you've got to embrace it to, enhance the value of the company, really, amongst all your investors as well as potential new investors, because without it, I think you're going to fall behind a little bit in the future.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much to both of you. That was absolutely fantastic. Big round of applause from behind our muted microphone. So thank you very much again. Yes, exactly.
Thanks, Sarah.
And now what we're going to do is we're going to delve into the world of that safety, the environment, the health aspects. And as Louise was saying during her presentation, this is in part a journey. So in terms of the maturity of how you discuss all these different aspects, how you report on them, how you share this information. And this is something that Kieran, as he wants to come into unmute himself and begin to share his slides. Kieran's going to share some of the research that he's been doing for his PhD in just this area. And as you can see here, as we're sharing those slides, the title of his talk is Environmental and Social Maturity as a Tool for Guiding Responsible Practice in the Extraction of Raw Materials. So with that, Kieran, over to your lovely self. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for allowing me to speak at the conference. It's a pleasure to be involved in what is a great community, and it's forming some great engagement as well, which is fantastic. I'm Kieran. I'm a second year PhD student at the Camborne School of Mines in Cornwall, and also research associate with Satala. And my general research area is in safety and sustainable development in small scale mining. So that's part of a wider European project called Impact, and it's developing a whole system solution for small scale mining. My role within that was to develop ideas around what we can do about maximizing our safety and sustainability with regards to this small scale paradigm. But for today, in the context of responsible raw materials, I was going to talk about some of the research associated with this concept of cultural maturity and how we can link that to the environmental and social factors to help guide responsible practice. So yeah, I'll go into a bit about what the whole responsible extraction idea, looking at safety, culture, maturity in the mining industry, how those models have been developed, sharing structure and approach to develop this so-called environmental and social culture maturity and its associated criteria. So then you can use that to perhaps enhance your responsible practice through this structured guidance. So as we know, societal demand globally is placing pressure on the extractive industry to continue that sufficient supply of raw materials into the manufacturing sector. And the increasing rate of extraction is often at detriment to the environment and their local communities, particularly when things go wrong. And mineral reserves are often evaluated on their economic value, but you need to go beyond that and look at the social and environmental value of that reserve. So I'd say that more clarity is required for those operating companies on what they should be doing to be considered responsible. So the safety culture model is based on a 5-tier framework, which I'll go into in a minute. And basically I've adapted that to suit the criteria you might expect for environmental and social. So safety culture in general, basically past accidents in industry have motivated a lot of studies into the relationship between safety culture and the instance of workplace accidents. So it's not just someone tripping and falling, it's like, why did they trip and fall? What was the leading root causes, the leading indicators associated with that particular incident taking place? So that safety culture refers to overriding perceptions of employees and management towards those safety issues. So you can define safety culture maturity of an organization by their amount and quality of training, the effectiveness of communication related to health and safety, and the extent to which management take responsibility. So basically the 5 models, 5-tier model there. So you've got the lowest level, pathological, basically is we don't care if we're not caught, but it then moves along up through each stage to ensure that you're meeting minimum requirements, have those systems in place, but then you start working your way even higher to saying that safety is how we do business around here. So you can say the maturity of an organization's safety culture is a vital factor when considering how improvement measures will be implemented. And in this context, maturity refers to the ability of people to respond to those impacts appropriately whilst knowing how to act based on local circumstances. So basically trying to define this for safety culture as those assembly of characteristics and attitudes that establish a priority safety issues receive the attention warranted by their significance. I'd say that socio-environmental culture similarly might be defined as the prevailing attitudes and perceptions of management. Employees towards occupational risks that have direct and indirect implications, localities, authorities, and ecosystems. So this is the model in question. Basically, it includes 4 tiers in this case, basically to prevent someone using this to take a middle ground approach to say, oh, we're doing the minimum requirement, you need to go one way or the other. And each tier outlines the expected characteristics of what a company or operation should be doing in terms of, in this case, environmental policy, remediation, community integration, and impact assessment. So you've got the basic level where very few risk assessments performed, mitigation measures are very limited. But as you work your way through, you're starting to bring more of those standards into play, just going beyond compliance, bringing in schemes to help improve the environment up at the highest levels, building that mutual trust rather than relying on things going wrong to respond to it. Similarly with social culture, 4 tiers there. But again, it's in terms of social policy, in this case, community relations, opportunities for employment, and perhaps the social impact assessment aspects as well. So just not really engaging in, well, in the lowest level, not really engaging in community employment aspects like that. But as you move your way forward up through the model, you've got those strong relationships being built throughout, maintained throughout the mine life into closure. The remediation work delivers beyond the expectation as well. And again, you've got that local employment coming through. So based on some reading into what the existing standards and principles out there that exist, such as IFC, ICMM, GRI, tried to glean some of the main factors that could define a company's environmental, social, culture maturity. Things like management assessment of impacts and risks, incident analysis, energy and resource management, waste and pollutant management, and biodiversity. In the case of social, things like CSR, SIA, community dialogue and employment and education, even conflict management, things like that. So looking at the environmental maturity criteria itself, so taking a few examples from environmental, basically the lowest level of basic, where I've tried to define what a basic company would look like from that perspective of each factor. So as you work your way through some of those, the criteria starts to build up in to reflect the tier, basically. So there's those 4 tiers, and then the final one is basically the typical questions you might ask a person using this, a company or specialist using this model. What questions you'd be asking them in order to get the appropriate responses to fit somewhere on these tiers. So in my opinion, maybe using a tiered culture allows the assess and the existing maturity level of their company. And then from there, you can start to establish the improvement measures that are required based on the criteria in the higher tiers. So you can start to structure your strategy in certain areas going forward and start to prioritize it as well. So it's to enable management teams and extractive companies to self-assess their current approach to those socio-environmental issues and decide how and in what areas they may improve. So to summarize, currently I say mineral reserves value it mostly on the economic value. We need to also consider the environmental and social value, and adjusting the existing safety culture models and its structure to address those aspects may be a way to guide some aspects of responsible practice, particularly maybe small mines, which was what this was originally designed for. And the next steps be developed suitable maturity criteria for the social and perhaps even the governance considerations, so it's completely aligned with the existing ESG principles and structure. So thank you very much for listening. Happy to take questions, feedback on the models, their criteria, anything like that. So yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Kieran. And yes, as per usual, you can hear that fantastic applause coming through to you online. With this, and as per usual, we've got some fantastic chatter going on and good discussion that you have sparked with your presentation. So you mentioned that this has been designed for some of the perhaps the smaller operations or companies as a whole. Where do you think that you see differences in terms of what the smaller mining operations versus the larger mining operations should perhaps be looking for, or what kind of differences do they see?
In terms of the environmental and social performance?
Yeah.
Well, in terms of the small scale mining paradigm we're trying to develop with the project, the impact project, it's obviously been containerized a lot of the solutions. So in terms of the chemicals you might use, it depends on the processing techniques, but the quantities are reduced, and you know, the quantities of water and energy requirements are reduced as well. So on the other hand, you've got a reduced workforce as well, and how much of that can be local when a lot of this needs specialist equipment specialist knowledge to run the equipment. So I think basically with that whole paradigm as well, it's a quick commissioning time. You need to react quickly. So it's about a hit the ground running approach, and this model allows you to see quickly where you sit in terms of your current approach, And then from there, you can use that criteria to move yourself forward. And obviously, it's designed to be easily digestible, so that it can be, so those responses can be more quickly gleaned. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you very much, Kieran. And just, I guess, building on that, there's a question here that's come in from Alexander, and he's asking, what are the main environmental advantages of underground versus open pit mining based on your evaluations?
Yeah, good question. I mean, open pit, it's harder to keep a closed system, I guess. But it depends on the commodity and the processing techniques. Because, well, environmental, with underground, you can't then see the surface damage because that depends on the infrastructure at the surface. But in terms of open pit, that's very obvious, the scar left on the surface. So that's where the post-closure comes in you have to be quite careful about that. So, yeah.
Thanks for that, Kieran. Just, I guess, going back to maybe the first question and building on it a bit further, with regards to the models that you've put together here, are they ostensibly meant to be used for operations that are currently under operation, or could you take the same frameworks and apply it, say, to exploration or to an operation that is going through closure, etc.? So can you take the same models and apply it to any stage in that value chain?
Ideally, yeah. I mean, that's where the different criteria comes in and those different factors. And that's where I want to look at all the stages and what factors come into play from an environmental and social and perhaps even governance perspective, so that you can look at it in different stages. And the earlier you start looking at this, the easier it is to implement the changes you need to make. But in terms of post-closure, there's aspects of the criteria in there regarding post-closure. And then, yeah, you can then start to, you can use it hopefully at any stage and be able to get some kind of improvement out of it. And that's the goal. Try and help improve the situation at a site, whether that's hit the ground running from the start of operations or whether you're reviewing your current performance over a period of time due to an auditor or something like that.
Great, thank you. Now, I know that you did touch on this towards the end of your talk, but what is next in your PhD? And I realise that COVID-19 is probably disrupting some of your plans as a whole. But what are you going to look for next when you, as you're completing your PhD?
Well, it will be trying to optimise these models so they cover more relevant criteria. And I guess going back to the safety side of things, there's aspects that can relate to health and safety here as well. So kind of refining the safety culture models for what is required in modern mining, even small scale. So I think that's where my direction is going at the moment, to be honest. So yeah, as I say, the email is there, so I'm open to feedback from people on these so far. And if you've got any other questions, feel free to drop me an email. Happy to answer things like that.
Thanks, Kieran. So final question, I promise, before we release you. And I mean, you almost have answered this with your previous answer, but maybe you want to build on it. And this comes in from Fiona, and she's asking, how is this being practically applied for small scale mining?
That was the next plan. So I had plans with my supervisor to arrange visits within the UK to study some mine sites and take this cultural maturity model to them so they could use it themselves and see if we can glean some improvement measures over a period of time through this structured guidance. So that is kind of the next step with this, I suppose, to test it. At this point, it's optimizing the criteria as far as I can.
Great, thank you very much, Kieran. And I mean, I think just to that as well, and maybe building on your answer back to Fiona here, I was recently, obviously before we were locked down in the south of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and some of the artisanal miners there, I have to say that their attitude towards safety was far superior to perhaps the attitude and the culture that was being exhibited by some of the larger scale mining companies. So I think that whilst talking about maturity scales, etc., may feel like more of a larger organization type tool. It is very much present, I think, in far smaller operations as a whole. Kieran, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, just in final comments.
Yeah, it comes back to those attitudes, and that's where this criteria builds on the way it's worded. It's trying to build on the behaviours that you'd expect certain tiers, so they can kind of identify themselves based on what the criteria is telling them. So yeah, it's down to that management approach to safety and environment, social.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Kieran, and a massive round of applause from all of us on the other side of those microphones. So whilst Kieran stops sharing his slides, we're going to come across to the lovely and wonderful Michael and Tim. You guys can work out who is lovely and who is wonderful. And I think that Michael's going to be sharing his slides for us. And this is our last session, and before we all get released to go and have a bit of a stretch and go and get on with our days before reconvening at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And Michael and Tim are experts on a great manner of different things, but they're going to speak to us today about beneficial ownership, which is absolutely integral to the success of every mining organisation and many other organisations around the world. So with that, gentlemen, over to your wonderful selves, Michael and Tim.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that introduction. While I'm just trying to find the button, yeah, just share my screen. And you should now see the opening slide of what is a brief presentation. Just to introduce myself, and I'll let Tim briefly introduce himself. My background is actually in the oil and gas business. I worked for BG Group, British Gas, for more than 12 years in their government relations function, mainly in the Middle East, but also in Southeast Asia. And also during that time, I worked a great deal on transparency issues and was the lead on the relationship with Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the ITI. I've been an independent consultant now for coming up for 6 years. And in that time, Tim and I have worked on a number of EITI projects, including several on beneficial ownership and beneficial ownership projects kind of outside of the ITI for the British government and in Azerbaijan. That's briefly who I am. I'll just let Tim introduce himself before we carry on.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So my name's Tim Law. My background is in the mining sector. So I spent about 12 years working for Anglo American, where I looked after all issues of tax transparency, tax stakeholder engagement and reputation and policy globally for the Anglo Group. So across Africa, Latin America and Australia and a few other places. I've also been an independent consultant now for coming up for 6 years. And as Michael says, we've worked together on a number of transparency and governance type related projects. I've also done work for a number of the FTSE 100, advising them on how to manage their reputation around tax issues and payments to government, relationships with government, and how that kind of keys into license to operate and those sorts of issues. So that's me.
So Tim and I have spent a lot of time recently thinking and researching and writing about essentially the business case with beneficial ownership transparency, how private sector companies, both in the mining sector, in the oil and gas sector, but further in other sectors as well, can actually benefit from and use beneficial ownership information for their business advantage. And this is the kind of focus of this presentation, is to kind of set out that business case. And this kind of feeds into the responsible business agenda in the sense that companies can demonstrate responsibility, not just by complying with regulations on disclosing beneficial ownership, but actively promoting beneficial ownership transparency, and then making use of public beneficial ownership information to ensure they do business with responsible companies. So avoid companies that are involved in either conflict minerals or child labor, or just have suffered problems with corruption and so forth. So the kind of three kind of key points for this short presentation is, for companies, this is often framed in the sense that companies are just complying with regulations and have to supply information to a register, whether it's public or not. And this is all around anti-money laundering and countering illicit finance. But actually, we look at the flip side of this. There are huge benefits for companies from using beneficial ownership, and these benefits, the public good of this information, far outweighs the modest cost of providing beneficial ownership information, either whether it's in this country or anywhere else. And having transparency around beneficial ownership of companies really is it makes a huge contribution to a more open, competitive business environment. You understand who you're doing business with, your partners, your suppliers, and any of your competitors. Avoid things like conflicts of interest and so forth. And also, companies, as I say, can demonstrate a degree of responsibility or help the situation by also actively promoting beneficial ownership. And at the end, we'll say a bit about how they can do that, not just in their home country, but in everywhere where they operate. Just to very briefly set out what we mean by beneficial ownership. This is a reasonably new topic on the kind of responsibility agenda, and it's only really kind of emerged in the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years, but has a longer history. And what we mean is the people, the real human beings like you and me, who ultimately own a company, or traced back to a recognized stock exchange with robust governance regulations such as London, Toronto, New York, etc., or companies that are wholly owned, completely 100% owned by a government agency. So you don't get so much in the mining sector, but in the oil and gas sector, things like state-owned oil and gas companies. And although the term is usually beneficial ownership, it means ownership and control. So people who control companies either through appointing directors, voting rights, and so forth. That's very briefly on the definition. And at the moment, there's a whole range of sources of beneficial ownership information. There are a very limited number of public registers. There's only about 3 or 4 in existence worldwide. The UK has one and was one of the first to legislate for this and set up what they call persons of significant control register, which is part of the Companies House. And so now there's a legal obligation on every company registered in the Companies House to provide details of its beneficial ownership on registration, and also make an annual return to confirm that the information remains accurate, and to notify changes. And then if there are changes within the year, you have 14 days to notify a change. So that information is freely available. You go onto the company's website, you can search by company, as the illustration shows here, or you can search by individuals, and as well as all the other usual information you get from Companies House, like filing history and accounts and so forth. You click on that tab highlighted and you can get the persons with significant control. There are some exemptions, but that's how it works. The only other countries in the world that have anything like this are Denmark, Ukraine, and I believe Slovakia, but more are coming. All EU member states should have a public register by this year under anti-money laundering directives, and EITI obliges implementing countries to produce this information, and several other countries are in the process of legislating or implementing this. Ghana, for example, Nigeria, amongst others. There are some private specialist providers, due diligence companies, database companies who provide this information either on a commission basis, for a fee, specifically for a specific transaction, or they produce databases of companies' owners. If you're doing business with a company, you can ask the company itself that you're acting as a supplier. And there are other, obviously, public source of information out there, open source information, press reports, and so forth. So at the moment, there's a large variety of sources. And the issue with this is that very little of it is reliable in the sense that it's verified. Even the UK register is not verified, it's self-reported. although the UK government is introducing measures to make it more reliable and make it and verify some of the information. But companies using this information have to spend a lot of time and effort collecting information, paying for it to be collected, and verifying it. And public registers with verified information would remove some of that, but not necessarily all of that burden, and create a public good in making more of this information available, and particularly to small and medium-sized companies. And Company House research has shown that they're one of the biggest users, because small and medium-sized companies don't tend to have the resources and budgets to undertake this research for themselves or to commission third parties to do the research. And now, having gone through that kind of opening, just hand over to Tim to actually set out what the business case for beneficial ownership transparency, and about the point about promoting beneficial ownership transparency.
Thanks, Michael. So in terms of the business case, and just to explain why we're looking at this, as Michael said, we've done quite a lot of work in this area around beneficial ownership transparency, and the default position is that this has been a debate between civil society organizations and actors pushing for more transparency in ownership of companies, and the elimination of kind of opacity in corporate ownership, and government agencies. And there was a bit of a gulf in interest and understanding from the private sector, and Michael and I got involved in working on a project to specifically look at this aspect of beneficial ownership. And it really kind of drew out quite how important it is and potentially beneficial it is to businesses from a pure commercial perspective. So one aspect of that is knowing who you are doing business with, and that means not just I guess the face of the business that you may actually be interacting with, in terms of whether it's your supplier or whether it's your customer who you are directly interacting with, but who is it that's actually benefiting from that business? Who is it that actually owns and controls that business ultimately? And is that person somebody who you necessarily want to be doing business with? Now there are kind of the real sharp end of that as to, you know, is this company potentially ultimately owned by somebody who is on a sanctions list, or is known to operate in an ethical manner that you wouldn't want to be associated with? Or is it simply a fact of giving yourself some more comfort that there are bona fide people behind the business, and that it has the sort of credentials that you would want to be dealing with? So it really helps businesses in understanding who they are operating with. I think out of the context of public registers of beneficial ownership, there are lots of businesses that want to know this information and pay a lot of money to find out this information already. And it's interesting that if you go back to the Global Anti-Corruption Conference in Copenhagen back in the end of 2018, it was there that BHP announced that they were producing for their own benefit a register of the ultimate beneficial owners of every company in their supply chain. So that's about 16,000 companies. And this was a register just for their own benefit, because they saw the commercial advantage of understanding who was ultimately behind these businesses. But that they had to generate through a lot of their own, or are generating no doubt through a lot of their own work, and also probably paying people to research and understand that. What we're talking about here is having a readily accessible register so that every business can get that same benefit that BHP clearly sees from doing all that work. And it also contributes to a more open business environment, in that if you are looking to enter a market or operate in a market, you can actually see who the different major players are within a particular sector. You can understand where there may be a concentration of influence if multiple companies actually are ultimately beneficially owned through the same route. That may suggest that the environment for operating in that particular sector is a bit more challenging. It can also contribute to a level playing field for procurement. It's clearly of great interest if the beneficial owner of a company against whom you may be competing for a particular contract turns out to be somebody who has some particular influence, or maybe directly linked to the company or even government agency that might be doing the procurement. So it opens up an awful lot of boxes that may otherwise be closed in terms of understanding that procurement happens on an equal footing, I suppose, for all businesses. It helps you to understand the risks in your supply chain, so that could be around potential risks of conflict of interest in your supply chain, or, as I mentioned already, sanctions, or simply that there is a particular political risk associated with a particular part of your supply chain because the ownership sits in a jurisdiction where you may not have readily chosen to do business, but actually you find that inadvertently you might be doing business in that jurisdiction or effectively with that jurisdiction. And I've kind of already mentioned the last one, which is around conflicts of interest and corruption, fraud and other crimes. It helps businesses to do what in a lot of cases they're having to do anyway, which is understand who their customers are and understand the financial transactions they're engaging in order to be comfortable that they're not facilitating corruption, fraud, money laundering, financing of terrorism and all these other illicit financial flows, that it's far too easy for legitimate businesses to end up associated with. So there's a really good business case for understanding who the ultimate beneficial owners of businesses are, and therefore as a consequence of that, there's a really good business case for there being public registers, because what that does is just make that whole process that much easier for businesses. And if we can ping on to the last slide, Michael. Thank you. So just very briefly, because I appreciate we're running out of time, what is it that businesses could be doing here proactively? Well, the first thing is clearly, and responsible businesses will already be doing this, complying with legal requirements to provide beneficial ownership where one exists. And as Michael has said, there are a number of jurisdictions that currently have public registers. There are also a number of other jurisdictions that have registers that aren't in the public domain, but in the first instance, complying with legal requirements. But what else can businesses do? Well, they can make a public statement of support of beneficial ownership transparency. Lots of businesses in the extractive sector are very familiar with making statements that they support the principles of transparency and they support the principles of good governance and all these sorts of almost stock phrases now. Expanding that to say that businesses support beneficial ownership transparency is an important step in galvanizing that private sector support. Businesses could also advocate for public beneficial ownership registers in countries where they operate. There's a real misconception in some government circles that the private sector is vehemently against transparency and beneficial ownership. And that's partly born out of the fact that some of the narrative has just been around compliance burden and too little of the narrative has been around commercial opportunity. And so I think there is something that businesses can do to try and alleviate that. Businesses can also support beneficial ownership transparency by demanding this sort of information from their business partners, and also to the extent that they identify discrepancies in information that's being reported under different platforms, to actually highlight that and show the consequences of misreporting and misunderstanding who you're doing business with. So I appreciate we've taken up most of the allotted time there, Sarah, but very happy to take any questions that anybody may have on either the concept of beneficial ownership or the business case for public registers.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Tim and Michael. And whilst you may have utilised your time slot to the max, you've also been answering questions behind the scenes. So thank you, Michael, for answering some of those questions whilst Tim was talking. But if I may sneak one little question or comment, perhaps, to you that has been coming through here on the chat. And this comes from Ludovine, and she's saying that what she finds very interesting about this is that it makes the case for more transparency in countries where we work, where perhaps this information is non-existent. And as companies, we run a huge risk of contracting with people we should not, i.e. potential corruption. Also then building on that, there's perhaps that the clash with the requirement for quotas for, e.g. local procurements, where there may be question marks around who is benefiting from the ownership of those companies versus going to more broader procurement where perhaps companies actually are a bit cleaner with regards to the beneficial ownership. Do you have any comments with regards to that, Tim or Michael?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, companies see the need for this information, and actually local content or quotas for particular types of companies to be involved in procurement are one area where beneficial ownership absolutely helps. So as part of, before lockdown, I was in Kenya holding a workshop on this topic. And one of the issues that came up there is that there are regulations in public procurement for companies owned by vulnerable groups, disadvantaged groups, to get preference in public procurement. The problem is that people set up front companies that look as though they're owned by a vulnerable person, somebody who's maybe disabled or something else, but actually the ultimate ownership is just a politician or somebody who has no right to make use of that quota. And so beneficial ownership in that sense absolutely helps identify that the people who are trying to take advantage of either local content requirements or some other requirement are actually genuine and not, just front for somebody trying to take advantage. So there are all kinds of uses for this information is, as I say, to keep to help promote a kind of open and transparent and equitable procurement process and supply chains.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that, Michael. I think as well, a massive thank you to both yourself and to Tim for bringing, as per usual, a different slant to the discussion actually that we've had for much of this morning, because this is an aspect where often people, they know about it, but they don't perhaps understand it in the level of detail that you guys certainly do. So thank you very, very much. Big round of applause from all of us around the world. So Michael, if you'd be able to stop sharing your screen. And what I'd just like to do before we say goodbye and release everybody for their lunch times or to go to bed, or depending on where you are in the world. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter what we do at the moment, what time zone you're in. Of course, you're allowed to go to bed and have a little nap. This morning, we've had some brilliant talks, really inspirational, I think, and thought-provoking. So be it starting off with Eleanor, who was talking to us from Brisbane, with regards to what are some of those risks associated with different commodities and the research that she's putting together there. Then Catherine sharing with us some of those changes that we've seen within the rare earth elements market. And whilst we've managed to diversify where those minerals actually come from, the majority of that processing is still going through those outfits within China as a whole. And what does that mean from an environmental or social stance? Because of course, within China, those environmental rules have improved dramatically over the last few years. Then we heard from Zach and Aidan using the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework and as a mechanism to ascertain how do you calculate the whole value for a particular asset or an organisation rather than just slices of that value. Then we went to Neil, our actuary, who apparently I outed as being an actuary. I'm pretty sure that if you look on his LinkedIn profile, he's already outed himself. And this was a case here where saying, well, how can we take those actuarial tools for modeling, measuring and predicting different aspects of risk, for example, within the world of raw materials? So these are normal tools that are used in the world of insurance, financial services. Can we actually adapt some of those and help them to maybe on a semi-quantitative basis, perhaps begin to pull together some of these other aspects that we're talking about here with regards to responsible raw materials? Then we heard about within the world of quarrying, what does a competent workforce look like and how do you try and build that, from Julian. And then from Louise and Nigel, taking a real life case study of CAML and what they've been doing in terms of generating and writing the sustainability report, which I think was a really interesting insight to say, actually, what does this mean to an organization? Why do you actually do it? And where are the difficulties with regards to doing it? Then we had the lovely Kieran sharing some of his PhD research in terms of that social and the environmental maturity scales and modelling, etc. there. And then finally ending up with the wonderful Michael and Tim looking at beneficial ownership. So as per usual, ladies and gentlemen, all of this has been streamed live on YouTube. And thanks to those of you who are enjoying watching it on YouTube rather than logging in through Zoom, that is 100% okay. Also, for those of you who log in later to watch later on, what we're seeing is a massive uptick of people watching all of these recordings later on. So that's absolutely brilliant. With regards to later on today, so the second slot, so yes, it starts at 3 o'clock this afternoon. For those of you who are speaking as part of this slot, you are more than welcome to log on half an hour in advance of 3 o'clock. So that's at 2:30 UK time, just to practice sharing the slides and make sure that everything is working as a whole. This afternoon, we've got another fantastic lineup for you, just as fantastic as this morning's was, and we're joined by a range of individuals from North America, so they will be fast asleep at the moment, but we've got a range of fantastic people joining us both from North America and from here in the UK to look at all of those different facets, from the finding and the extracting and the processing of those raw materials through to the selling and the buying, and how do we make sure all of this is done in the most responsible way possible. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is now 6 minutes past 11, so that we are slightly late, but not too bad. I hope you have a lovely lunchtime or a lovely few hours off, and see you later on today. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to our speakers again. Bye.